Introduction: The Beetle and the Fly by David Cronenberg. I woke up one morning recently to discover that I was a 70-year-old man. And this is different from what happens to Kroger Salesman in the Metamorphosis. He wakes up to find that he's become a near human-sized beetle, probably of the scarab family, if this household chairwoman is to be believed, and not a regularly robust specimen at that. Our reactions, mine and Gregor's, are very similar. We are confused and bemused, and think the momentary delusion will soon dissipate, leaving our lives to continue as they are. What could the source of the twin transformation possibly be? Certainly in the birthday coming from many miles away, and it should not be a shock or a surprise when it happens. And as any well-meaning friend will tell you, 70 is just a number. What impact on the number will have on an actual, unique, physical human life? In the case of Gregor, a young traveling salesman spending the night at home in the family's apartment in the Perig, awakening into a strange human/insect hybrid existence is, to say the obvious, a surprise. He did not see it coming. The reaction of the household mother, father, sister, maid, cook is to recoil in a bemused horror, as one would expect, and not one member of the family feels compelled to console this creature by, for example, pointing out that the beetle is also a living thing and turned into the mite, or for a mediocre human being a humdrum life, be it exhilarating and elevating experience. And so what's the problem? This imagined constellation could not, in any case, take place in the structure of the story, because Gregor could understand human speech, but cannot understand when he tries to speak, and so his family never thinks to approach him as a creature with human intelligence. It must be noted, though, that in the Burgess banality, they somehow accept this creature is, in some unnameable way, their Gregor, and it never occurs to them that, for example, a giant beetle has eaten Gregor. They don't have the imagination, and he quickly becomes much more than a housekeeping problem. This transformation seals him within himself as surely as if he had suffered a total paralysis. These two scenarios, mine and Gregor, seem so different. One might ask why I even bother to compare them. The source of the transformation is the same, I argue. We both have awakened and forced awareness of what they really are, and the awareness is profound and irreversible. In each case, the delusion soon proves to be new mandatory reality, and life does not continue as it did. Is Gregor's transformation a death sentence, or, in some way, a fatal diagnosis? Why does the beetle Gregor not survive? Is it the human brain, depressed, sad, and melancholy, that betrays the insect's basic sturdiness? Is it the brain that defeats the bug's urge to survive, even to eat? What's wrong with the beetle? Beetle is the order of insects called Cleopatra, which means sheathed wing, though Gregor never seems to discover his own wings, which are presumably hiding under his hard wing casings, are notably hardy and well adapted for survival. These are species of beetle in any other order on Earth. Well, we learn that Gregor has bad lungs. They are none too reliable, and so the Gregor beetle has bad lungs as well, or at least the insect equivalent, and perhaps his fate really is his fatal diagnosis, or perhaps it's his growing inability to eat that kills him, as it did Kafka, who ultimately coughed up blood and died of starvation because of the laryngeal tuberculosis at the age of 40. What about me? Is my 70th birthday a death sentence? Of course, yes it is, and in some ways it has sealed me within myself as surely as it suffered total paralysis, and is a revelation of the function of bed and of dreaming in a bed, the mortar in which the minute of everyday life are crushed or ground up and mixed with memory and desire and dread. Gregor wakes up from troubled dreams which are never directly described by Kafka. Did Gregor dream that he was an insect, then awake to find that he was one? What in the world had happened to me, he thought. It was no dream, says Kafka, referring to Gregor's new physical form. It is now clear that his troubled dreams were anticipated insect dreams in the movie I co-wrote and directed by George Langley's short story, The Fly. I have our hero, Seth Bertle, played by Jeff Goldblum, while in deep and thorough and transformation into a hideous fly/human hybrid, I'm an insect who dreamed that he was a man and loved it. But now the dream is over, and the insect is awake. He is warning his former lover, and now he is in danger to her. A creature who compassion and no empathy. He has shed humanity like the shell of Psittaca's nymph, and has emerged no longer human. He's also suggesting that the human has self-aware consciousness is a dream that cannot last, an illusion. Greg is too troubled clinging of what is left of his humanity, and his family begins to feel that the thing in Gregor's room is no longer Gregor. He begins to feel the same way, but unlike Brundle's fly self, Gregor's beetle is no threat to anyone but himself, and starves and fades away to the afterthought as his family reveals in their freedom and the shameful, embarrassing burden that he has become. In The Fly, was released in 1986, there was much conjecture into the disease that Brundle had bought on himself as a metaphor for AIDS. Certainly, I understood this. AIDS was on everybody's mind in the vast scope of disease that is gradually being revealed. But for me, Brundle's disease is more fundamental. In an artificially accelerated manner, he was gauging. He was conscious that he was aware his body was mortal, and an acute awareness in the human participated in that inevitable transportation that all of us face, if only we live long enough. Unlike the passive and helpful but anonymous Gregor, Brundle was a star in the firmament and the science, and it was a bold and reckless experiment in transmitting matter through space. His DNA mixes that an errant fly that caused his predicament. Langley's story is published by the Playboy magazine in 1957, follows firmly in the genre of science fiction, which all mechanics and reasonings of science hero carefully, if I fancy fully, constructed. 2 used telephone booths were involved. Kafka's story, of course, is not science fiction. It does not provoke discussion regarding technology and the hubris of science investigation, or the use of science research for military purposes. Without sci-fi trappings of any kind, the Metamorphosis forces us to think in terms of analogy, or reflective interpretation, though it is revealing that none of the characters in the story, including Gregor, ever does think this way. There are no meditation on the family or secret or sin that might have induced such a monstrous reprisal of God, or the fates of no search for meaning, even on those basic essential plane. The bizarre event is dealt in a pre-functory, petty, materialistic way. It arouses the narrowest range of emotional response imaginable, almost immediately assuming the tone of an unfortunate natural family occurrence which one must reluctantly contend. Stories of magical transformations have always been part of humanity's narrative canon. They articulate the universal sense of empathy for all life forms that we feel. They express the desire for transcendence, and every religion also expresses. They prompt us to wonder if transformation into another living creature will be proof of a possibility of reincarnation and some sort of afterlife, and is thus, however hideous or distracting as the narrative, a religious and hopeful concept. Certainly, my Brundlefly goes through moments of maniac strength and power, convinced that he has combined the best components of the human and insect and become a super being, revisiting to see personal evolution in a way but a victory even as he begins to shed his human body parts, which he carefully stores in a medicine cabinet he calls the Brundle Museum of Natural History. There's none of this in the Metamorphosis. The Samson beetle is barely aware that he's a hybrid, though. He takes small hybrid pleasures where he can find them, whether it's hanging from the ceiling or scuttling through the mess of the dirt in his room, beetle pleasure, or listening to the music that his sister plays on her violin, human pleasure. But the Samson family is the Samson beetle context in his cage, and his subservience to his needs of the family both before and after his transformation extends, ultimately to his realization that it would be more convenient for him to be just disappeared. It would have been an expression of his love for them, in fact, and so he does that, just that, by quietly dying. The Samson beetle's short life, fantastical though it is, it played out on the level resolutely mundane and functional. It fails to provoke in the story characters any hint of philosophy, meditation, or profound reflection. How similar would a story be then, if, on that fateful morning, the Samson family found in the room of their son not a young, vibrant, traveling salesman who was supporting an unselfish and endless labor, but shuffling, half-blind, barely 89-year-old man using insect-like canes, a man who mumbles incoherently in a sole of his trousers and out as a shadowland of the dementia, projects angers and induces guilt. If, when Gregor Samson woke this morning in troubled dreams, he found himself transformed right there in his bed into a demented, disabled, demanding old man. His family is horrified, but somehow recognize him as their own, Gregor, albeit transformed. Eventually, though, as in the beetle variant of the story, they tried to be so no longer their Gregor, and that would be the blessing for him to just disappear. When I went to the publicity tour for The Fly, I was often asked what insect I'd want to be if I underwent an etymological transformation. My answers varied depending on my mood, though I had a fondness for the dragonfly, not only for its spectacular flying, but also for the novelty of its ferocious underwater nymphal stage, which is deadly extendable under strung jaw. I also thought it was mating in the air might be pleasant. What would that be your soul then? Is dragonfly flying havenward? Came one response. Is that not really what you're looking for? No, not really, I said. I'd just be simple dragonfly, and then, if I managed to avoid being eaten by a bird or a frog, I would mate, and as summer ended, I would die. Chapter 1. When Gregor Samson woke up one morning from troubling dreams, he found himself transformed right there in his bed into some sort of monstrous insect. He was lying on his back, which was hard, like a cargo base, and when he raised his head low, he saw his curved brown belly segmented by rigid arches atop the blanket. Already slipping, he was barely managed to clean. His many legs, pitifully thin compared to the rest of him, waved helplessly before his eyes. What in the world has happened to me, he thought. It was no dream. His room was a proper human room, if admittedly rather too small, lay peacefully between the four familiar walls. Above the table, where an unpacked collection of cloth samples was arranged, Samson was traveling salesman, hung a picture he had recently clipped of the glossy magazine and placed in an attractive gilt frame. His picture showed a lady in a fur hat and a fur bow who sat erect, holding out a viewer of a heavy fur muff which in her entire forearm had vanished. Gregor's gaze had been shifted to a window where bleak weather raindrops would be heard striking the metal sill, made him feel quite melancholy. What if I just go back to sleep for a while and forget all this foolishness, he thought. But it was probably utterly impossible, for it was a habit to sleep on his right side. In his present state, he was unable to resume his position. No matter how forcefully he thrust himself into his side, he kept rolling back. Perhaps 100 times he attempted it, closing his eyes so as not to see the struggling legs, and relented only when he began to feel faint, dull ache in his side, unlike anything he ever felt before. Good Lord, he thought, what an excruciating profession I've chosen. Day in and day out on the road. Work like this is far more unsettling than business conducted at home. And when I have the agony of traveling itself to contend with, whirling of the train connections and irregular palatable meals and human intercourse that is constantly changing, never developing in at least consistency or warmth, devil take it all. He felt a faint itch high up on his belly, still on his back. He laboriously edged himself over the bedpost as he could raise the head more easily. Identified the side of the itch, a cluster of tiny white dots he was unable to judge, and wanted to probe the spot with a leg. But he drew back again at once, for a touch sent cold shivers rippling through him. He slid back into his earlier position. All this early rising, he thought. It's enough to make one soft in the head. Humans need their sleep. Other traveling salesmen like harem girls. When I go back to the boarding house, for example, to copy out the morning's commissions, why, these gentlemen may still be sitting at breakfast. I'd like to see my boss's face if I tried that sometime. He'd can me on the spot. Although, who knows, maybe that would be the best thing for me. If I didn't have to hold back for my parents' sake, I'd given notice long ago. I'd marched right up to him, given him a piece of my mind. He was falling right off his desk, and what an odd custom that is. Perching high up atop one's elevated desk from a considerable height, addressing one's employee down below, especially as the latter is obligated to stand quite closely because his boss is hearing. Well, all hope is not yet lost. As soon as I've saved up enough money I to pay back my parents owe him, another 5 or 6 years ought to be enough. I'll most definitely do just that. This would be a great parting of ways for the time being, though. I've got to get up. My train leaves at 5. And he glanced over the alarm clock ticking away atop the wardrobe. Heavenly Father, he thought. It was 6:30, and the clock's hands kept shifting calmly toward. And in fact, the half hour had already passed. It was getting on towards 6:45. Could the alarm have failed to ring? Even in the bed, one could see it properly set at 4 o'clock. It must have rung. Yes, it was possible to sleep tranquilly through the furniture-shaking racket. Well, his sleep hadn't exactly tranquil, but no doubt that's why it had been so sound. But what should he do now? The next train was at 7 o'clock to catch it, and he would have to rush like a madman. It was a simple case, it wasn't even packed yet, and he himself felt a jar of agile and alert. And even if he managed to catch his train, his boss was certain to unleash a thunderstorm and invective upon his head. For the clerk who met his 5 o'clock train had no doubt long since reported Gregor's absence. His clerk was his boss' underling, a creature devoid of a backbone and wit, as you call it in sick. But that would be mortifying and also suspicious, since Gregor had never once been ill in his 5 years of service. No doubt his boss would come calling with the company doctor, who would reproach Gregor's parents for his son's laziness, silencing all objections by referring them to his doctor, in whose opinion existed only healthy individuals unwilling to work. And would the doctor be so terribly wrong in his instance? Aside from the mild drowsiness, it is certainly superfluous. After so many hours of sleep, Gregor felt perfectly fine. In fact, he was ravenous. While he was considering these matters with the greatest possible speed, yet still without managing to make up his mind to leave the bed, the clock was just striking 7:15. A timid knock came at the door of the bed. "Gregor," the voice called. It was his mother. "It's 7:15. Didn't you want to catch your train?" The gentle voice. Gregor flinched when he heard his own response. It was unmistakably his old voice, but now had infiltrated as if below by a tortured peeping silence impossible to suppress, leaving each word intact, incomprehensible, but only for an instant before he completely annihilating it as it continued to reverberate, and the person would not tell for sure whether his ears were deceiving him. Gregor had meant to give a proper response, explaining everything, but under the circumstances he limited himself to saying, "Yes, thank you, Mother. I'm just getting up." Because of the wooden door, the change in Gregor's voice appeared not to be noticeable from the other side, for his mother was reassured by his response and shuffled off. But their brief conversation had alerted the other family members that Gregor was unexpectedly still home, and already his father was knocking on one of the room's side doors, softly but with his face. "Gregor, Gregor," he called. "What's the problem?" And after a short while he repeated his question in a deeper register. "Gregor, Gregor!" Meanwhile, at the other side of the door came his sister's faint lament. "Gregor, are you unwell? Do you need anything?" "Just a second," Gregor answered with both directions at once, making an effort and insinuating that as clearly as possible and inserting long pauses between the individual words. to remove anything conspicuous from his voice, and in fact his father returned to his breakfast, but his sister whispered, "Gregor, open the door, I implore you." But Gregor had no intention of opening the door. He praised the cautious habit he had acquired while traveling and locking all the doors at night, even at home. First, he would get up calmly and undisturbed. He would get dressed and above and all the breakfast, and only when he would consider his next steps for all these supine contemplations, he suddenly realized would yield no useful results. He recalled often having felt mild aches and pains in bed, caused perhaps by lying in an awkward position, and his pain has been proven to be a figment of his imagination the moment he got up. He was curious to see how his morning imaginings would gradually fade. The change in his voice was nothing more than a harbinger of the proper head cold. An occupational hazard among traveling salesmen, he had doubted not in the least. It was simple enough to rid himself of the blanket. He needed only puff himself up a bit, and it felt right off. But the rest would prove difficult, not least because he was exceedingly wide. He would have needed arms and hands to prop himself up, but instead he had these many low legs, variously in motion, as he was unable to control. If he tried to bend one leg, it would be the first to straighten, and when he finally succeeded in getting one leg to do his bidding, all the others went falling without an unnerving frenzy. Enough of this lying about uselessly in bed, Gregor said to himself. At first, he tried to maneuver the lower part of his body out of the bed, and then the lower part, which, by the way, had not that seen and couldn't properly imagine proved too unwieldy. It all went so slowly, and when at last, half mad with impatience, he thrust himself recklessly toward with all his strength, it was in the wrong direction, and he slammed against the lower bedpost. The throbbing pain he felt instructed him that now, for at least the lower part of his body, was perhaps the most sensitive. So he decided to try leading instead with his super body, and carefully twisted his head toward the edge of the bed. He was easily accomplished, and in the end, despite with the width and height and weight, the mass of his body slowly followed the turning of his head. But once his head had dangled in midair outside of the bed, he was afraid to keep shifting forward like this, since even if eventually he had let himself fall in his position, it would be practically a miracle if his head didn't escape the injury, and right now he had to keep his wits about him at all costs, even if it meant staying where he was. But when, sighing over redoubled efforts, he found himself lying there as before, watching his little legs engage in the struggles, perhaps more flaringly now, and seeing no possible way to bring calm or order to this chaos, he told himself once more that he could not possibly remain lying there any longer, and that the most sensible thing would be to sacrifice anything and everything as long as there remained even the slightest hope of liberating himself from the bed. Simultaneously, though, he continued to remind himself that calm consideration, indeed, the calmest consideration, was far more preferable in the resolution season despair. At such moments, he fixed his eyes sharply at the possible on the window. But regrettably, the view of the morning fog, which veiled even as far as the narrow street, offered little of the way to optimism and good spirits. 7 o'clock already, he said to himself, as the clock struck one more. It was already 7, and such dense fog. For a little while he lay there quietly, his breathing shallow, and expression, perhaps, was a little perfect. Silence might possibly restore a real ordinary state of things. Then, he said to himself, before it strikes the quarter past 10, I must absolutely have gotten myself completely out of bed. Besides, by then someone will have come from the office to inquire after me, as the office opens before 7, and now he'd set himself to rocking his body out of the bed as evenly as possible, along his entire length. If he allowed himself to fall from the bed like this, his head, which he intended to lift up cleanly when he fell, would in all likelihood remain unharmed. His back seemed to be hard. Surely it would sustain no damage as he fell onto the rug. His greatest concern was what to do in this loud crash that would clearly result, no doubt, calling forth not terror perhaps, but certainly alarm behind each door. Nonetheless, it would have been to be ventured. By the time Gregor was already protruding halfway out of bed, his new method was more a game than a struggle. All he had to do was keep rocking sideways a little at a time. It occurred to him now simple things would be only someone come to his aid. 2 strong individuals, he was thinking his father and his maidservant, would suffice. All they would have to do is slip their arms underneath the curved back and scoop him out of bed, then crouch down with their burden and wait patiently for him to flip himself over onto his floor, where he hoped his tiny legs would in fact take on some meeting. But even aside from the fact that his doors were locked, should he really call help? Despite this distress, he didn't think, smiling at the thought. Already he'd reached a point where his vigorous rocking motion was making it impossible for him to keep his balance, and soon he would have to make up his mind and take the plunge. For a quarter after 7 was only 5 minutes away, and when the front door bell rang, it's someone from the office. He said to himself and nearly froze with his little legs when scrabbling over more frantically. For a moment, all was still. They won't answer, Gregor said to himself, caught up with some deluded hope. But then, of course, as always, the maid strode resolutely to the door and opened it. Gregor needed to hear the visitor's first words of greeting and know who it was, the general manager himself. Oh, why was Gregor condemned to serve in the firm where his most negligible falling short was enough to arouse the greatest possible suspicion? Was every last one of the firm's employees a scoundrel? Was there not a single loyal, devoted soul among them who would be driven mad by pangs of conscience should he fail to make the best possible use of even just a few morning hours for his employer's benefit, such that his guilt would render him virtually incapable of rising from his bed? Would it really not suffice and send an apprentice to inquire, if indeed such inquiries were all necessary at all? Did the general manager have to come in person? And was it necessary to demonstrate to an entire innocent family that an investigation of a suspicious matter could be entrusted only to the general manager's sharp intellect? And more because of the agitation aroused in Gregor by his train of thought than because of some proper resolution on the part, he swung himself out of bed with all his might. There was a loud thud. You couldn't really call it a crash. The rug cushioned the impact a little, and since his back was more elastic than he thought, the resulting sound was muffled and not so obvious. But he hadn't managed to hold his head up carefully enough to have bumped it. He turned it his way and pressing against the rug in vexation and pain. Someone just fell in there, the general manager now said in the room on the left. Gregor tried to imagine whether anything like what he was now experiencing could ever befall the general manager. The possibility must certainly be admitted, but as if bruisingly dismissing the question, the manager now took on a perceptible step in the next room, making his patent leather boots creak. From the room on the right came a whisper of Gregor's sister informing him, "Gregor, the general manager is here." "I know," Gregor murmured, but he didn't dare raise his voice high enough for his sister to hear. "Gregor," his father now said from the room on the left, "the general manager has come to inquire why you failed to depart on the early train. We don't know what to tell him. Besides, he'd like to have a word with you, in person. So please open the door, and I'm sure he'll be kind enough not to take offense to the untidiness of your room." "Good morning, Herr Sama," the general manager now cried out in the friendly tone. "He isn't well," Gregor's mother said to the general manager while his father was still having a say beside the door. "Not well at all. Take my word for it, sir. Why else would Gregor miss his train? The office is the only thing the boy ever thinks of. It really bothers me that he never goes out in the evenings. He's been back in the city for an entire week now, and he's spent every last evening at home. He just sits at the table with us, quietly reading the newspaper, or else studies in the timetables. Even when just doing woodworking projects seems to entertain him. He carved a little picture frame, for example. Did it in 2 or 3 evenings with just a fret saw. You will be amazed how pretty it is. It's hanging there in his room. You'll see it in a minute when Gregor opens the door. Oh, and I'm so glad you paid us a visit, sir. On our own, we'd never been managed to persuade Gregor to open up. He's so stubborn, and surely he isn't well, even though he's denied it this morning." "Be right there," Gregor said, not moving. "So you missed a single word in the conversation." "No other explanation, madame. It is conceivable to me," the general manager said. "Let us hope it is nothing grave. Though, on the other hand, I would note that a businessman, fortunately, or unfortunately, as one will, they are very often obliged to suppress dispositions out on the consideration of the firm. So are you ready to let the general manager in?" Gregor's impatient father asked, knocking on the door. "No," Gregor responded, in the left-handed room, horrified silence. While in the room on the right, Gregor's sister began to sob. Why didn't his sister join the others? She must have gotten out of bed and not yet begun to dress. And why is she crying? Because he wasn't getting up and opening his door to the general manager? Because he was in danger of losing his position, and because his boss would be the bounding of his parents, once more over the ancient debt? For a time being, all such words are assuredly unnecessary. Gregor was still there, and abandoning his family was the farthest thing of his thoughts. At the moment, to be sure, he wasn't lying on the rug, and one familiar in his current state would seriously inspect him and let the general manager in. But surely he wouldn't be packing just like that because of so trivial an act of discourtesy, for which it would be simple enough to find an appropriate excuse later on. And it seemed to Gregor it would be far more sensible to just leave him in peace rather than disturbing him with all his weeping and cajoling. But the others were distressed by uncertainty of it all. Their behavior was understandable. "Herr Salzman," the general manager now called up, raising his voice. "What come over you? You barricade yourself in your room. You reply to the queries only with yes and no. You cause your parents earnest unnecessary worries, and you are neglecting, let me permit myself to note, your professional responsibilities in truly unprecedented manner. I speak here in the name of your parents as well as your employer. In all seriousness, I must ask you to be clear and immediate explanation. I am astonished, utterly astonished. I have always known you as a calm, sensible person, but now it seems you have begun to permit yourself the most whimsical extravagancies. To be sure, the boss did suggest one possible explanation for your absence this morning. It concerns the cash payments recently entrusted in your care, and truthfully, I all but gave him my word of honor that this explanation could come to be correct. but confronted here with your incomprehensible obscenity, I find myself losing my any desire. I might have come for your defense, and your position is anything but secure. It was originally my intention to discuss all with you in a private conversation, but since you compel me to waste my time here, I do not know why your esteemed parents should not hear of it as well. In short, your productivity is late and is highly unsatisfactory. Admittedly, it is not best the season you're drumming up business. We do acknowledge this, but a season in which no business at all is drummed up is something that is not indeed may not exist, Herr Salesman. No, but sir, Gregor cried out beside himself, forgetting all the size and agitation. I shall open the door at once, this very instant. A slight indisposition, a fit of dizziness kept me from getting up. Even now I'm still in bed, but already I'm feeling very much refreshed. Here, I'm getting up. Just a moment's patience. It is a bit more difficult than I thought, but already I'm feeling quite fine. How odd, the way thing can suddenly come over one. Yesterday evening I felt perfectly all right. My parents can attest to this. Or rather, I did in fact feel a mild foreboding yesterday evening already. Surely it was noticeable to anyone looking at me. Why didn't I send word to the office? But we always just assume we'll be able to overcome these illnesses by staying home, sir. Do be gentle with my parents. The allegations you make are unfounded, and no one has ever mentioned anything of the sort to me. Perhaps you haven't looked over the most recent commissions I sent. In any case, I'll be back on the road in time for 8 o'clock train. These additional hours of rest have fortified me. Please, do not allow me to detain you any longer, sir. I shall be at the office myself in no time. Do be good as you say. I'm on the way, and give my regards to the boss. And while Gregor was hastily blurting out all this, scarcely knowing what he said, he edged closer to the wardrobe with minimal effort. No doubt thanks to the practice he had already acquired while still in his bed, but now he did his best to haul himself upright. Indeed, he already did not open the door to show himself to speak in the general manager. He was eager to learn about the others, who were so anxious to see him, would say when they finally laid eyes on him, if they recoiled in horror, Gregor would surrender all responsibility and rest easy. But if they accepted it all calmly, it meant that he, too, had no reason to get himself worked up, and if he hurried, he could still make it to the station by 8. At first, he couldn't get a grip on his wardrobe's smooth surface, but finally he gave a great heave and found himself standing straight upright. He no longer paid any heed to the pain in his lower body, ache as it might. Now he let himself drop against the back of his nearby chair, clinging to the edges of his little legs, and having to attain control of himself, he fell silent. For now he could listen to the general manager. Did you understand a single word? The general manager was asking Gregor's parents. Surely he isn't trying to make fools of us. For heaven's sake, Gregor's mother cried, already weeping. He might be gravely ill, and here we are tormenting him. Gretty, he cried out. Mother, Gregor's sister called out the other side, while they're communicating through Gregor's room. You must go for the doctor at once. Gregor is ill. Quick, fetch the doctor. Did you hear him speaking just now? That was an animal's voice, the general manager said, speaking in a noticeably subdued tones, compared to the cries of Gregor's mother. Anna, the father shouted to the kitchen through the vestibule, clapping his hands. Run and fetch locksmith, hurry. And already the two girls were racing through the vestibule, their skirts rustling. How had Gregor's sister possibly gotten dressed so quickly and flung open the front door? There was no sound of the closing again. No doubt they have left it standing open, as one sees with apartments in which giant calamity has occurred. But Gregor was far less troubled now, even though the others were no longer able to understand his words, though they had seen him clearer than in the past, perhaps because of ear had grown accustomed to their sound. They were now convinced that these things were not right with him, and were prepared to offer help. The confidence and conviction in which these first arrangements had made comfort him, he felt drawn once more into the circle of humankind and was expecting both the doctor and the locksmith, without properly differentiating between the two, to perform magnificent-sounding feats, so as to have unintelligible voice as cause for the crucial discussions that lay ahead. He cleared his throat a little, making an effort to do this as discreetly as possible, since even his sound might differ from the human throat-clearing. Since he was no longer entrusted himself to judge, in the next room, meanwhile, all was quiet. Perhaps his parents sat whispering at the table, with the general managers, or perhaps all of them were leaning against the door, listening. Gregor slowly pushed himself over to the door using the armchair, then let go and allowed himself to fall against the door, propping himself upright. The pads of his lower leg turned out to be slightly sticky, and there he rested briefly from exertions, and he set out turning the key in the lock using his mouth. Unfortunately, he seemed to have no real teeth, so how was he supposed to grasp the key? But his jaws turned out to be surprisingly strong, and with their help he actually succeeded in causing the key to move, paying no heed to the fact that he was no doubt injuring himself in the process, for a brown fluid ran out of his mouth and down the key, dripping onto the floor. "Listen to that," the general manager said in the next room. "He's turning the key in the lock." Gregor found these words most encouraging, but all of them could have been cheering him on, including his father and mother. "Come on, Gregor," they would have shouted. "Just keep at it. Keep it on the walk." And now, imagining all of them following his efforts with great suspense, he bit down the key uncomprehensively, with all its force he could muster. With each revolution of the key, he danced around the lock, holding himself upright only his mouth and, as needed, either clinging to the key or using the entire weight of his body to press it down. The brighter sound of the lock finally springing open positively revived him. Sighing relief, he said to himself, "I guess I didn't need the locksmith after all," and he laid his head upon the handle of the door and pressed it open. But remained hidden from his view as the door swung toward him. Even after it was wide open to be seen, that had worked his way slowly around one of the wings of the double door, a delicate operation as he wanted to avoid plopping down awkwardly on his back before he entered the room. He was still occupied with his difficult maneuver and no leisure to attend to anything else, when he heard the general manager utter aloud, "Oh!" It sounded like wind howling, and now he saw him too. Saw how general manager, who was standing closest to the door, pressed his hand to open his mouth, slowly retreating as though he was driven back by an invisible steady force. Gregor's mother, who despite the general manager's presence stood in her hair still undone from the night, while bristling, looked over his father, her hands clasped, then took 2 steps to Gregor's direction before falling down in the midst of her bellowing skirts. And her face vanished completely, where it sank to her bosom. Gregor's father clenched his fist to a hostile grimace, as if he intended to thrust Gregor back into his room, then glanced uncertainly about the living room, shaded his eyes in which his hands, and wept until his mighty chest shook. Gregor made no move to enter the room. Instead, he leaned from the inside against the wing of the door and bolted fast, so that only half his body and head inclined sideways above it, and he could be seen and peered across the others. Meanwhile, it had grown much lighter out, and on the other far side of the street, a section of an infinitely long, dark gray building opposite a hospital came into view in the irregular windows punched into a facade, raining and still falling, but only in large drops that were separately visible and seemed to have been hurled by one up to the ground. An inordinate number of breakfast dishes crowded the table, for Gregor's father considered breakfast the most important meal of the day, and would drag it out for hours, reading various newspapers. Straight ahead, on the opposite wall, hung a photograph of Gregor from his time in the military, showing him to be second lieutenant. The carefree smile as he rested his hand on his dagger, command respect for his bearing and his uniform. The door in the vestibule was open, and since the front door was open as well, that one could see all the way out of the landing and the head of the stairs leading down. "Well," Gregor said, quite conscious of the fact that he was the only one who had restrained his composure, "I shall get dressed at once, pack my samples, and be on my way. As for the rest of you, are you prepared to let me do so? Can you see, sir?" he said, addressing the general manager. "I'm not obstinate, nor a shrieker. Traveling is burdensome, but without it, I cannot live. There are you going to do now, sir? The office? Yes. Will you report all these things truthfully? A person could be incapable of working in the moment, but this is precisely the right time to recall his earlier accomplishment and consider that he will later, once the hindrance has been overcome, work all the more industriously and greater focus. I'm so dreadfully indebted to the boss. Surely you are aware of this. On the other hand, I have my parents and sister to think of. Truly, I am a bind, but I shall work my way out of it. Don't make things more difficult for me than they already are. Take my side at the office. No one loves us drummers, I know. Everyone thinks a salesman rake is a king's ransom while enjoying life's pleasures, but there never any particular cause to reconsider his prejudice. But you, sir, have a far better grasp of the general circumstances than the rest of the staff, better even, if I may speak so confidentially, than the boss himself, who is the role of businessman, could in his opinion, to the employee's advantage, and you no doubt know quite well that the drummer, who spends almost the entire year already from the office, can easily become the victim of gossip, happenstance, and groundless complaints against which he cannot possibly defend himself, as he usually never learns of them, or only when he has completed one of the journeys, exhausted, and then back at home, is forced to observe the dire physical effects of causes and no longer be identified. Please, sir, do not leave without saying something to show you agree with me, at least to some small extent." But the general manager had already turned away as soon as Gregor began to speak, and merely glanced back at him over a hunched shoulder. His mouth contorted, and during Gregor's speech, he did not stand still for a moment, but instead continued to retreat, not letting Gregor out of his sight, in the direction of the door, not only gradually as though they were secretly prohibited to exit the room. Already, he was in the vestibule, and to judge by the abrupt motion in which he drew his foot from the living room for the last time, one might have supposed he had just burned it. Having reached his vestibule, however, he reached out his right hand, gesturing broadly in the direction of the stairs, as if some all but supernatural salvation awaited him there. Gregor realized he could not possibly allow the general manager to depart from his present frame of mind, and his own position at the firm was not to be put in the gravest jeopardy. His parents didn't fully comprehend his situation. Over these long years, they had formed the conviction that Gregor was provided in his office for life, and besides, they were also preoccupied with their present words that they were bereft of all foresight. But Gregor was not in the foresight. The general manager would have been detained, reasoned with, convinced, and finally won over. After all, Gregor's future of the family depended on it. If only his sister were here. She was clever. She had only begun to weep while Gregor was still lying quietly on his back. And surely the general manager, ever a ladies' man, would have let himself to be assuaged by her, and she would have closed the front door in the apartment and talked him out of his fear of the vestibule. But his sister was not there, so Gregor himself would have to act, and without stopping to consider what he not yet familiar with his current abilities with respect to locomotion, nor even to take into account the fact that the last speech of his had quite possibly, indeed, probably alluded to the comprehension, he let go of the door, forced his way through the opening, meant to walk over there, and the general manager, already out of the landing, was foolishly clutching at the banister with both hands. But right away, groping in vain for someone to catch hold of, he fell, with a faint shriek upon his many little legs. No sooner it occurred than he felt, for the first time all morning, a sense of physical well-being. His legs had solid ground beneath him. They obeyed his will perfectly, and he noted the delight they even strove to bear him wherever he wished, and already it seemed to him to be soon delivered by all his sufferings. But as he lay there on the floor, directly in front of his mother, not far from her, swaying his mobility held in check, he suddenly leapt up, wrapped as she had appeared within over her contemplations, leapt high up into the air, her arms thrust wide, fingers spread, crying out, "Help me, for God's sake, help!" Her head cocked on the angle as if Gregor better, but then contracting this, she sensibly retreated. But she had forgotten the table set for breakfast just behind her, sat down hurriedly upon it as soon as she reached it, and as absent-mindedly, it didn't even seem to notice a big overturned coffee pot beside her was pouring a thick stream of coffee onto the rug. "Mother, mother!" Gregor said softly, gazing up at her. For a moment he had forgotten all about the general manager. On the other hand, he would not restrain himself, and he held this flowing coffee from snapping his jaws several times. At this, the mother gave another shriek and fled from the table into the arms of Gregor's father, as he rushed her to her aid. But Gregor had no time for his parents now. The general manager was already on the stairs, his chin propped on the banister. He looked back on the scene one last time. Gregor was preparing to dash after him to be sure to catching up with him. But the manager just had to sense something, for he leapt down several steps at once and vanished, and the cry of horror he gave as he fled resounded through the stairwell. Unfortunately, the manager's flight now appeared to be utterly discombobulated Gregor's father, who up until then had been relatively composed. For instead of running after the manager himself, or at least not hindering Gregor in his own pursuit, he seized the manager's walking stick in one hand, and had been left lying on the armchair along with the overcoat and hat, and with the other took up a large newspaper from the table, and set to driving Gregor back into his room with a great stamping of feet. Brandishing both newspaper and stick, all Gregor's entreaties were in vain, nor were they even understood, for submissively he might have swiveled in his head. His father only stamped his feet for all the more ferociously across the room. His mother had flung open the window despite the chilly weather, and, in leaning out, she pressed her face into her hands far outside the window frame. Between street and stairwell, a powerful draught arose. The window's curtains flew in the air, the newspaper on the table rustled, for a few pages scuttled across the floor. Inexorably, Gregor's father drove him backward, uttering hissing sounds like a wild beast man, but Gregor had no patience of reverse locomotion, and his progress was very slow. If he had been permitted to turn around, he had been back in his room at once, but he was afraid of provoking his father's fury with a time-consuming maneuver, and at any time a fatal blow from the stick in his father's hand might be crashing down on his back or head. In the end, though, he had no alternative. Horrified, he realized he was incapable of controlling his direction, and so he began, with consternation, to glance back at his father, to turn around as quick as he could, which in fact was rather slowly. Perhaps his father discerned his good intention, for he did not hinder him as the operation, but instead even guided the rotation there from a distance. Using the tip of the stick, only his father were not making that unbearable hissing noise. But it made Gregor lose his head completely. He had already turned almost all the way around when, still and then hissing in his ear, he became confused and started turning back in the wrong direction. But when finally he succeeded in positioning his head in front of the doorway, he turned out that his body was too wide to fit through the opening. And of course, in his father's current state, it was not possibly occurred to him to open the door other wing to create an adequate passage. He was fixated on the notion that Gregor must disappear into his room as quickly as possible. Never would he have tolerated the complicated preservation necessary for Gregor to pop himself up so as possibly to pass through the door in its upright position. Instead, as though there were no obstacle at all, he now drove Gregor before him, raising a great dying, what Gregor heard with the back no longer resembled a voice of merely a single father. It was do or die, and Gregor thrust himself, come what would, into the doorway. One side of his body tilted up, rising at the angle, pressed forward, scraping his one flake raw and leaving ugly stains behind the white door. And soon he was wedged tight, unable to move on his own. On one side, his little legs dangled trembling in the midair, while on the other they were crushed painfully beneath him. When his father administered a powerful shove from behind, a genuinely liberating thrust that sent him flying, breathing profusely into the far reach of his room. The door was banged shut with a stick, and then, at last, all was still. Chapter 2. Only as dusk was falling did Gregor wake from his heavy, faint-like sleep. He probably wouldn't have slept much longer even with the disturbance, or he felt sufficiently rested and restored, but it seemed to him that he had woken a fleeting step and a careful shutting of the door of the vestibule. The plaid gleam in the electric sleep lamps touched the ceiling here and there in the upper edges of the furniture, but down where Gregor lay was all dark, slowly groping artfully in his feelers, which he was only now learning to appreciate. He dragged himself toward the door, wanting to see what happened. His left side felt like one long, unpleasantly contracted scar, and he was forced to limp outright with his 2 rows of legs. One of his diminutive legs, indecently, had suffered grievous injuries in the course of morning events. It was almost miraculously only one had been injured, and now trailed lifelessly behind him. Not until he reached the door did he realize that, in fact, that had lured him there. It was the smell of something edible. There stood a bowl filled with sweet milk. It was the little pieces of white bread were floating. He almost sighed with delight, for his hunger was now even more powerful than in the morning, and right away he dunked his head in the milk almost up to his eyes, but he quickly drew it out again in disappointment. It wasn't that eating was difficult thanks to the tender left side. He couldn't eat it all without his entire body becoming gradually involved. But beyond that, even though the milk had always been his favorite drink, there's no doubt why his sister had brought him some now, it didn't taste good to him at all. Indeed, it was almost within revolution that he turned away from his bowl and crept back to the center of the room. In the living room, as Gregor saw through the crack, the glass has been lit. But while usually at the door hour, his father liked to read aloud the afternoon paper to Gregor's mother, and sometimes his sister as well, in a dramatic voice. Now there is not a sound to be heard. Well, perhaps it is customary, reading aloud that his sister had often told and written him about had recently fallen out of practice. But even in the other rooms, everything was so still. Even though the apartment was surely not empty, it was quiet life by family had been leading, Gregor had said to himself, as he gazed fixedly into the darkness before him. He felt great pride having to be able to give his parents and sister a life in such a beautiful apartment. But what if his all tranquility, all of this prosperity and contentment were now coming to a horrific end, so as not to get lost in the complications? Gregor set himself in motion, crawling back and forth across the room. Once in his course, the long evening of one of the side doors opened a tiny crack, and then quickly shut again, and once another one. Someone must have felt an urge to enter, and overcome by misgivings. Gregor now stationed himself just in front of the living room door, determined to somehow coax the hesitant visitor inside, or at least find out who it was. But the door did not open again, and Gregor waited in vain. Before all the doors were locked. Everyone kept trying to come in, and now he had opened the one door, and the others had apparently opened during the day. No one came. The keys were sticking in their locks from the outside. It was late at night by the time the light of the living room went out, and now it was easy to discern that Gregor's parents and sister had remained awake all this time, for all 3 of them would clearly be heard departing on tiptoe. Now it was unlikely anyone would come to Gregor's room before morning, so he had plenty of time to ponder the rest to reorder his life. But his high open room, in which he was forced to lie flat on the floor, distressed him, without being able to determine the cause. After all, it was his room, which he had liked living in for 5 years now. And with a half-conscious motion, and not without a twinge of shame, he scurried beneath the settee, where even though his back was a bit cramped, he could no longer raise his head. He once felt right at home, his only regret being his body was too wide across to accommodate entirely beneath the piece of furniture. Here he remained the entire night, which he spent turning to dozing, though he was awoken again and again by his hunger, and mulling over his worries and indistinct hopes, which however all led to the conclusion that, for a time being, he should have behaved calmly by employing patience and the utmost consideration, assist his family in enduring the inconveniences of the current state, inevitably forced him to impose on them. Early in the next morning already, so early it was almost still night, Gregor had the opportunity to test the strength of all the resolutions that he had made. For some of the vestibule, his sister, almost completely clothed, opened his door to cast an anxious glance into the room. He didn't immediately spot him, but when he noticed him beneath the settee, well, goodness, he had to be somewhere. It's not that he might have flown away. Yet the sight so alarmed her that, unable to control herself, she slammed the door from the outside. But as regretting this conduct, she opened it again and once came in, walking on tiptoe as though he was entering his room in a gravely ill patient or even a stranger. Gregor, having slid his head just beneath the edge of the setting tea, observed her. Would she had left the milk standing, or not because of lack of hunger, and she would bring him another food, more likely. If she failed to do so on her own accord, he would sooner starve than call this her attention, though, in fact, he felt as nearly monstrous urge to scoot out from underneath the settee, throw himself at his sister's feet, and beg her for something good to eat. But his sister immediately remarked to his surprise that the bowl was still full, and there's just a little milk spilled on the floor around it, and she picked it up right away, not with her bare hands to be sure, but with a rag, and carried it out of the room. Gregor was unexpectedly curious to see what he'd bring in instead and mulled over the various possibilities, but never would have been able to predict what his sister in her kindness proceeded to do. To gauge his taste, she brought him an entire assortment of foodstuffs, all spread out on an old newspaper. There were old, half-rotten vegetable bones from a family supper the night before, caked in a concealed white sauce, a few raisins and almonds, a piece of cheese Gregor had declared inedible 2 days before, a dry piece of bread, a slice of buttered bread, and a slice of bread with butter and salt. In addition, she placed beside a feasted bowl that apparently had been reserved for Gregor once and for all. It was now filled with water, and out of delicacy, since she knew Gregor could not eat in front of her, she quickly withdrew and turned the key in the lock so Gregor could understand he could make himself at home. Gregor's little legs whirred in how he went to take his meal. His wounds indecently seemed to have healed entirely in the meantime, for he no longer felt the least impairment. This is astonishing. For more than a month he could cut his finger just a tiny bit with a knife, and all wound had been painful enough just the day before yesterday. I best be fastidious than before, he thought, already sucking greedily at the cheese, to which he found himself immediately and actually drawn more than any other items. Quickly, his eyes shedding tears of gratification, he devoured in swift succession. The cheese, the vegetables, the sauce, the fresh food, by contrast, did not taste good to him. In fact, he could not even stand the smell of it, so he dragged the things he wished to eat a little to one side. He had long since finished everything. He was lying indolently where he was when his sister slowly turned the key in the lock as a signal for him to withdraw. At once she gave the start, though he'd been point of nodding off, and he hurried back under the settee. But it cost him a great deal of willpower to remain there the short period of time his sister spanned the room for the hearty meal. He enjoyed what caused the abdomen to swell, and he could scarcely breathe in confinement. In between little attacks of suffocation, he peered out in slightly bulging eyes at his sister. Oblivious, used a broom to sweep up not only the remains of the meal, but also the food he hadn't even touched, as if the items were no longer fit for consumption. Then she hastily dumped everything in a bucket, and she covered with a wooden lid before carrying all of the room again. She had scarcely turned back with Gregor, hauled himself out of the settee, stretching and puffing up his body. This is how Gregor now received his food each day. Once in the morning, when his parents and the maid were still asleep, and the second time after everyone had eaten lunch, for his parents would always nap a little afterward, and his sister would send the maid out for an errand or another. Surely they didn't want Gregor to starve either, but perhaps it had been through too much for him to experience his meal through a more hearsay, or perhaps his sister wanted to spare him even the modest sorrow, for Lord knows they were suffering enough. Gregor never learned when the pretext his doctor and locksmith had been sent away for the first morning, ever since for himself could not be understood. It occurred to no one, not even his sister, that he could understand the others. So when his sister came to his room, he had to be content merely by hearing the sighs she heaved now and then, and her words of supplication addressed the saints. Only later, when she had started to grow accustomed to all this, though, of course, it was impossible to become fully accustomed to circumstances like these, would Gregor sometimes catch a remark that was meant to be friendly where it could be interpreted as such. "He tucked right in today," she would say when Gregor found the food she left him particularly tasty. While in an opposite case, when gradually began to occur more and more often, she had a habit of saying almost mournfully, "This time he didn't touch a thing." And while no news reached Gregor directly, he sometimes was able to overhear this and that from the rooms on the other side of this. Whether he heard voices, he immediately run over to the door and questioned and pressed his entire body against it. Especially in the early days, there was rarely a conversation that did not somehow, if only directly, refer to him. For 2 days, every mealtime is spent deliberating how the family will only comport itself. But even between meals, his same discussion continued, for at least 2 members of the household were present at all times, since apparently no one wanted to remain at home, and of course, leaving the apartment unattended was out of the question. That much more, the maid had fallen to her knees before Gregor's mother the very first day. It was not entirely clear how much she knew of what had occurred, begging to be released from family service. But when she took leave in the quarter of an hour later, she tearfully thanked him for dismissing her, as though it was the greatest benefaction she had experienced in her hands, and without anyone asking this of her, she swore to solemn oath to never reveal anything at all to anyone. Now Gregor's sister was forced to do cooking in the concert with his mother. To be sure, not much effort was involved, as no one did much eating. Again and again, Gregor would hear one of them, pressing the others to eat, always in vain, and never with any other response than "Thank you, I've had all I want," or similar. Perhaps they would drink anything either. Often Gregor's sister would ask her father if he wouldn't like a beer, affectionately offering to fetch it herself, and when he did not respond she would say, wishing to relieve him of scruples, that she would send a porter's wife for it as well. And when the fathers would hear utter great no, and no one spoke of it any longer. Already in the course of the first day, Gregor's father explained his family finances and prospects not only to Gregor's mother, but to his sister as well. Now when he would let up the table and, from his small weathersome safe, which he had salvaged from his business collapsed 5 years ago, extract some receipt from memorandum book, he could hear him opening the complicated book lock and bolting it shut again after removing the desired item. The explanations on his father's part included the first bits of heart-giving news Gregor had heard since the captivity began. He had been under impression that his father had retained nothing at all from his former firm holdings. At least his father had never said anything to the contrary, and admittedly Gregor himself had never asked him about this. At the time, his only concern had been to do everything in his power to let his family forget as quickly as possible. The mercantile catastrophe had plunged all of them into a state of utter hopelessness. And so he had to get work to the particular zeal and risen almost overnight from petty clerk to salesman, in which capacity, of course, he had quite different earning potential, and his professional accomplishments in the form of commissions were immediately transformed into cash that could be plunked down on the table at home, before his eyes of his astonished, delighted family. Those are lovely times, and never since they've been repeated, at least not of such glory. Although Gregor later earned so much money that he was in position to cover the expenses for the entire family, which then he did. All had grown accustomed to the enrichment of not the family, but Gregor as well. The grateful accepted the money, and he was happy to divide it. But the exchange no longer felt particularly warm. Only Gregor's sister had remained close to him all this time. It was a secret plan to send her off to study the conservatory next year. Unlike Gregor, he dearly loved music, and could play the violin movingly. Despite the considerable cost it would no doubt entail, money that could surely be brought by other means. Often during the brief periods of time Gregor spent in town, the conservatory would come up with this conversation with his sister. Not only ever as a lovely dream without his realization was unthinkable, and her parents did not like to hear it mentioned even in the obvious way, but Gregor was thinking the matter over and great determination intended to make a formal announcement on Christmas Eve. Thoughts like these, utterly futile in the current state, passed through his head as he stood against the door, eavesdropping. Sometimes general exhaustion made it impossible for him to go on listening. He could carelessly let his head bump against the door, but then he could immediately hold his head still again. Breathing the faint silence produced had been heard in the next room, causing everyone to fall silent. "I wonder what he's getting up to now," his father would always say after a while, apparently facing the door, and only when he would interrupt the conversation would resume. Gregor now learned quite well. His father tended to repeat himself with explanations, in part because it had been so long since he had last concerned himself with such matters, in part because Gregor's mother did not always understand everything the first time. That, despite of all their misfortunes, a small nest egg, not only a tiny one, still remained to them from before, and had grown a little, thanks to the untouched interest that accumulated meanwhile. In addition, the money Gregor had brought home each month, he only ever kept a few gulden for himself, and not yet even entirely used up, and had grown into a small capital. Behind his door, Gregor nodded eagerly, delighted in his unexpected prudence and thrift. To be sure, he might use the surplus to pay off more of his father's debts than his boss, and the day in which he would be able to invest himself and the post would no longer be nearly so far off. But as he stood, his father's arrangements were no doubt for the best. Now his money was by no means sufficient to allow the family to live off the interest of anything of that sort. It might possibly have been enough to sustain a family for a year, 2 at most, but there was all there was. So in fact there was some kind of sum only one really shouldn't touch. One of the set aside in the case of emergency. The money to live on would have to be earned. Gregor's father would be admittedly in good health, but he was old and hadn't worked in a full 5 years. And in any case, he was supposed to avoid overtaxing himself. In those 5 years, the first holiday in the strenuous yet unsuccessful life had put a lot of weight and now lumbered as he walked. And that was Gregor's old mother now supposed to hold down a job, despite her asthma, and the fact that it was already an exertion for her to cross from one end of the apartment to the other, for which reason she spent every second day grasping for breath at the sofa beside the open window, and was his sister go out working, the child of 17, whose lifestyle no one would begrudge her, dressing nicely at a sleeping state. This child of 17 whose lifestyle no one would begrudge her, dressing nicely, sleeping late, helping out around the house, taking part in a few modest entertainments, and above all playing the violin. Whenever the family came to speak of the necessity of someone earning money, Gregor would go to the door and throw himself down upon the cool leather sofa beside it, burning with shame and sorrow. Often he would lie there an entire long night, not sleeping for a moment, just scrabbling for hours against the leather, or, not shunning the great effort it cost him, to push an armchair over to the window. He would climb up the sill and, propped on the armchair, lean against the window. Apparently lost some sort of reverie of now liberating, he always found it to gaze outside. For the truth, he saw even the objects were quite near and hand less and less clearly as the days progressed. The hospital across the way, whose all-constant sight he had earlier revealed, was now no longer even visible to him, and he had not known perfectly well as he was a resident of Charlottenstrasse, a quiet but perfectly urban street. He might have imagined it was gazing out of the window onto the desert in which the grey sky and the grey earth had indistinguishably conjoined. His attentive sister, who only had to see the armchair standing beside the window twice before starting to push it back to its place each time she tied it in his room. Indeed, she began leaving the window's inner sash open. If only Gregor would have been able to speak to his sister and thank her for all she could do for him, he would have found her misgivings easier to bear. As if it suffered beneath him, his sister, to be sure, did all she could to obscure the awkwardness of the situation, and the more time passed, the better she succeeded. Of course, even the way she made her entrance jingled his nerves. The moment she came in, without even pressing the door, although she always took the pains to shield the others from the sight of Gregor's room, she would race straight away to the window, fling it open with hasty hands as though it was part of suffocating, when it remained there, however cold it might be, gulping in the air. All this racing and racket was inflicted on Gregor thrice a day. He would be trembling beneath the salary, painfully aware that she would no doubt have willingly spared him the disruption if it were possible for her to endure being in the same room as Gregor with the window closed. Once, it must have been a month since Gregor's metamorphosis, so there was no particular call his sister had been startled by his appearance. She came into his room a little earlier than usual to discover him, motionless and propped upright for his horrific effect, gazing out of the window. Gregor would have not found it surprising if he had not chosen not to enter, since his position prevented her from opening the window right away, but she didn't just not enter, she started in an alarm and shut the door. A stranger might have thought Gregor had been lying in wait, meaning to bite her. Gregor naturally went and hid himself away beneath the settee, but he would wait until the noon before his sister returned, and she seemed far more agitated than usual. From this she understood the appearance was still unbearable to her, and would remain so, and that she no doubt had to struggle to force himself not to run away, in the sight of even a small part of his body that protruded from beneath the settee. In order to spare her even the sight, one day he carried the bedsheet over the settee on his back. This labor cost him 4 hours, and arranged it in such a way that it was now completely covered, so his sister would not be able to see him even if she bent down. If she considered the sheet unnecessary, it caused removed it, since it was clear enough that it would be possibly to be considered a pleasure for Gregor to shut himself off to completely. But he left the sheet where it was, and Gregor even thought he glimpsed a grateful look when, at one point, she carefully lifted the sheet just a little with his head to see how sister liked the new arrangement. During this first fortnight, Gregor's parents could not bring themselves to enter his room, and after he heard expressing their heartfelt appreciation of his sister's labors, whereas earlier they had often been annoyed with her, since she had seemed a rather useless girl. But now both of them, father and mother alike, would often just be waiting outside Gregor's door, while his sister would tidy up his room, and as soon as she emerged, would give him full report on what things looked like in the room, what Gregor had eaten, how he had behaved this time, and whether perhaps any modest improvement would be seen. His mother indecently had wanted to visit him relatively soon, but his father and sister held her back, appealing at first to a sense of reason as Gregor listened to attentively, wholeheartedly approving. Later, though, she had to be held back by force, when she cried out, "Let me go to Gregor, he's my unhappy son. Can't you understand I must go to him?" When Gregor thought it would perhaps be good for his mother to visit him, not every day of course, perhaps once a week, after all, she had far better grasp of things than his sister, who despite the courage was still a child, and when it came right down to it, and perhaps only on the difficult task of the child for frivolity, Gregor's wish to see his mother was soon fulfilled. During the day, Gregor avoided showing himself at the window, if only out of consideration for her parents, but there wasn't much crawling he could do in a few square meters of space that the floor provided. Lying still already difficult for him to endure without during the night. Eating soon ceased to give him even the slightest pleasure. So to divert himself, he took up the habit of crawling back and forth across the walls and ceiling. He particularly liked hanging from the ceiling, high above the room. It was completely different from lying on the floor. No one could breathe more freely there. The gentle swaying motion rocked the body, and in almost happy absent-mindedness Gregor experienced it might happen. In his own astonishment, he would let go in a crash to the floor. But now, of course, he had his body far better under control than before, and his even as great as fall as it did him no harm. His sister immediately noticed the new entertainment Gregor had devised for himself, the purgations left behind sticky trails here and there, and he got it under the head to make it possible for Gregor to range as widely as possible by removing the furniture and impeding his movement. Above all, the wardrobe and desk. But she wasn't able to do so on her own. She didn't dare to ask her father for help. The maid most certainly would not have helped her, for the girl was 16 or so. Though she had courageously remained in the household after the departure of the former cook, had at the same time requested the privilege of keeping the kitchen locked at all times, and only opening the door upon particular requests. And so the sister had no choice but to summon her mother. One day when her father was out, the mother arrived at an explanation of feverish joy, but fell silent at the door of Gregor's room. At first, of course, Gregor's sister checked to confirm that all in the room was as it should be. Only when then did she allow her mother to enter. In the utmost haste, Gregor had tugged the sheet down lower and lower in the looser folds, so that it really did look as the bedsheet happened to have been tossed over the settee. She also refrained from peering out of beneath the sheet at this time. For the moment he would resign himself not to be seeing his mother and be glad she'd come. "It's all right, come in, you won't see him," Gregor's sister said, apparently leading her mother by the hand. Gregor now heard the sounds of two weak women grappling with this, in fact, quite heavy old wardrobe, with his sister laying claim in the bulk of the work, not listening to abominations of her mother, who was afraid she would overtax herself. It took a very long time, but perhaps a quarter of an hour's labor. Gregor's mother said they should leave the wardrobe where it was after all. In the first place, it was too heavy. They would not finish before Gregor's father came home. By leaving the wardrobe in the middle of the room, they would prevent Gregor from moving around at all. And secondly, it wasn't even clear whether they were doing him a favor by taking away the furniture. To her, it seemed to be opposite was true. The sight of the empty wall positively oppressed her heart. And why should Gregor not experience the same sentiment? Since after all, long accustomed to having his future around him, wouldn't he feel abandoned in the emptied-out room? And if not, as if, this mother concluded in a low voice. In fact, she had been whispering all along, as though she wished to avoid letting Gregor, whose exact whereabouts she did not know, hear so much as a sound in her voice, for she was convinced that he could not understand her words, and it was not as if by removing the furniture he was showing that giving all hope of a cure, and ruthlessly abandoning him to his own devices. "I think it should be best that we try to keep the room in precisely the same state as it was in before, so that when Gregor returns to us, he will find everything unchanged, which will make it that much easier for him to forget all that's happened in the meantime." Hearing his mother's word, Gregor realized that he, sense of all direct human addresses, combined with the monetary life of family myths, must have been muddled in understanding over the course of these 2 months, for he did not otherwise explain to himself how he could seriously have wished to have his room emptied out. But he really didn't want to have his warm room, comfortably furnished with family heirlooms, transformed into a cave or den, in which, to be sure, he could be able to crawl out unhindered in every direction, but the present simultaneously swiftly and completely forgetting his human past. He was already on the verge of forgetting, and only his mother's voice, which he had gone along now without hearing, had shaken him awake. Nothing should be removed. Everything must remain. He was unwilling to forego the good influence of furniture and the bad had in his condition, and as if furniture got in the way of practically his mindlessly crawling about, this was by no means his deterrent. In fact, it was a great advantage. Unfortunately, his sister was in a different opinion. She had developed a habit, not entirely without the cause to be sure, of presenting herself as the holder of particular expertise in discussing Gregor with her parents, and so now her mother's counsel was reason enough for her to insist the removal not only of the wardrobe and desk, as she originally had been intending, but for every last bit of room's furnishings, with the exception of the indispensable settee. Naturally, with only childish defiance and hard-won self-assurance she had so unexpectedly acquired in recent weeks that dictated this demand, she had, in fact, observed that Gregor needed a great deal of space to crawl around, while as far as anyone could see, he made no use to answer the furniture. Perhaps the fanciful imagination of a girl her age played the role as well, a sensibility always seeking out gratification, and one which Gregor had allowed to persuade her to render Gregor's situation even more horrific than before, so as to be able to do even more for him than he had hitherto, for a room in which Gregor held sole dominion over empty walls is a place that no one other than Gregor would ever dare set foot. And so he had held fast to her resolve despite the protests of her mother, who appeared troubled to the point of indecision. Even by the room in the present state, she wanted to fell silent and helped Gregor's sister remove the wardrobe the best she could. Well, the wardrobe was something Gregor could do without if he need be, but the desk would certainly have to stay. And no sooner had the women left the room, the cabinet groaning as they pressed against its weight, and Gregor poked out his head from beneath the settee to see how he might cautiously and considerately as possible intervene. But unfortunately, his mother was the first to return while Gretty was still in the next room, clasping the wardrobe in her arms and tipping it back and forth in her own, without, of course, moving it from the spot. But Gregor's mother was unaccustomed to his appearance. It might have been made her ill to catch a glimpse of him, and so Gregor in alarm withdrew as fast as he could to the far end of the settee. But it was too late to prevent this front edge of the bedsheet from stirring a little. His was enough to attract his mother's notice. Startled, she froze for a moment, then went back to where Gretty was. Although Gregor kept telling himself that nothing extraordinary was happening, just a few sticks of furniture being shifted about, he was soon forced to admit that all coming and going on the part of the women were little exclamations of furniture scraping against the floor, the combined effect of the tumultuous hubbub intensifying all around him, and no matter how tightly he drew his head and legs and pressed his body against the floor, he soon was forced to consider that he would not be able to endure this much longer. They were clearing out his room, taking him from all that was dear to him. He had already borne away the cabinet in which he lay his fret saw and other tools, and now they were prying a loose desk that dug itself firmly into the floorboards. His desk, at which he had written his homework assignments as a student at a commercial academy, as a secondary, even a primary school pupil. Truly, there was no time left to explore the good intentions of these two women, whose existence, by the way, he had almost forgotten. For their exhaustion was now making labor in silence, and one heard their heavy footsteps. And when he burst out of hiding, the women in the next room were leaning on the desk, catch their breath, changing direction 4 times as he raced about, and he really didn't know what to say first. But now his eyes lit on the picture of the lady clad in all furs, conspicuous now on the otherwise empty wall, and quickly he made his way up to it and pressed himself against the glass, which had heard to him pleasantly cool against his hot belly. And at least his picture, which Gregor's body now covered up completely, was absolutely certain not to be taken away from him. He was leveled his head toward the living room door to observe the women as they returned. They didn't permit themselves much rest at all, and they're only on their way back. Gretty had slung one arm about her mother, nearly carrying her. So what do we take next? Gretty said, looking around. When her eyes met those of Gregor, who he clung to the wall. It was no doubt only because her mother's presence she kept her composure, bowing her face toward her mother to prevent her from glancing about. She said, hastily trembling to be sure, let's go. Back to the living room for the moment, shall we? Gretty's intentions were perfectly clear to Gregor. She meant to bring her mother safely and chase him from the wall. Well, let her try. He sat there in the picture and he would not give it up. He sooner leaped right in her face. But Gretty's words succeeded in unsettling her mother even more, taking one step to his side. She had a huge brown blotch on the flowered wallpaper, and before he was even able to realize that he saw it, there was Gregor. She ran out of the horse, shrieking a voice, oh God, oh God. I fell back upon the settee, her arms spread wide as though she were giving up everything, and lay there without moving. Gregor, his sister shouted, raising her fist in a threatening glower. It was the first time she had addressed him directly in the Metamorphosis. He ran into the next room and fetched some sort of essence that would awaken her mother from her faint. Gregor wanted to help as well, but seized time enough to save the picture later. When she stuck fast to the glass and had to tear himself away by force, he too then ran into the next room, and he might offer his sister advice of some sort, like in the old days, when he only stand idly behind her as he rummaged among the various little bottles and scared her out of her wits, and she turned around. One bottle flew to the floor and shattered. A shot of glass scratched Gregor's face, and some sort of corrosive medicine engulfed him. Without further delay, Gretty took up as many bottles as she could hold and ran to them to her mother, slamming the door behind her foot. Gregor was now cut off from his mother, who was possibly on the brink of death, for which he himself was to blame. He could not open the door if he didn't want to drive away his sister, who had to stay there with his mother. There was nothing for him to do but wait. As tormented by his worries and self-reproach, he began to crawl about, crawling over everything, walls, furniture, the ceiling, and finally, in his despair, the entire room began to spin around him. He fell smack in the middle of the big table. A short while had passed. Gregor lay there, spent, and around him all was still, possibly a good sign. Then the bell rang. The maid was naturally locked up in her kitchen, and so Gretty had opened the door. Her father was back. What happened? His first words. The look in Gretty's face had no doubt revealed all. Gretty's voice as he responded was muffled. Apparently she was pressing her face against his chest. Mother fainted, but she's better already. Gregor was broken out. That's just what I expected, his father said. I kept telling you, but you women refused to listen. To Gregor, it was just clear his father had misinterpreted Gretty's all too brief pronouncement to assume him guilty of some act of violence. So it behooved Gregor to try to pacify his father, as he was lacking both the same means to enlighten them, in which in his mind he fled to the door of his room and impressed himself against it, so that the moment his father came to the living room from the vestibule, he would see that Gregor had every intention of returning at once to his room, that it was unnecessary to drive him back inside, and that one merely to open the door, and he could despair at once. But his father was in no mood to take notice of utterly. "Ah!" he exclaimed once upon entering, in a tone of voice suggesting he was once fierce and glad. Gregor pulled his head back in the door and turned it toward his father. He was truly not expected to see his father looking as he looked now, standing before him, though he was sure the novelty of crawling about and distracting him recently from paying as much attention as before the goings of the rest of the apartment. And really, he thought he had been prepared to find a change of set of circumstances. Even so, was this still his father? The same man who used to lie wearily entombed in his bed when Gregor set off on his business trip, who would greet him on the evening of his return sitting in an armchair in a nightshirt, who, when incapable of rising, would merely raise his arms significantly in delight, and on the rare walks they had still shared a few Sundays each year and on the major holidays, would trudge between Gregor and his mother, who himself were already walking rather slowly, moving in a bit slower when they bundled up to the old overcoat, always in his gingerly advancing cane, and almost invariably coming to a halt, collecting his companions around him wherever he had something to say. Now he was standing properly erect, dressed in a smart blue uniform, his gold buttons and a sort worn out by porters in banking establishment. Above the jacket's tall, stiff collar was a powerful double chin unfurled. Beneath bushy eyebrows, his black eyes peered out acutely and attentively. His once still white hair had been painstakingly combed and parted until it gleamed. He tossed his cap, to which a gold monogram was affixed, probably that of the bank, across the entire room in the wide arc of the land of the city, even advancing grim-faced upon Gregor with his tips of his long uniform jacket flung back in his hand in the trouser pockets. He himself probably had no idea what he intended to do. At any rate, he raised up each foot unusually high, and Gregor marveled at the gigantic dimensions of his boot soles. But he did not lose any time over them, having learned on the very first day of his new life that his father considered only the utmost severity appropriate for him, and so he fled from his father, hesitating whether his father stopped short, and then rushing forward again as soon as stirred. They circled around the room several times in this manner, without anything decisive occurring, and indeed, given the slow speed at which the interaction was taking place, without even having an appearance of chase. For this reason, Gregor remained at the floor level for the time being, especially as he heard his father might consider a particular wickedness on his part in taking refuge in the wall of sailing. To be sure, he was forced to realize he would not be able to keep up even his pace for long, and since each time his father took a step, he himself had to execute any number of motions. A shortness of breath began to set in. Even in his early life, his lungs had been none too reliable. He had now lurched along, revering all his strength in his continued flight, his eyes barely open, and not thinking in his stupefaction that there might be other ways of saving himself than rummaging across the floor. Indeed, he had almost forgotten he always had the walls at his disposal, though here he had sure they were obstructed by the delicately carved furniture of full, jagged, pointing edges. All at once, something flew out of the rug beside him, casually flung and rolled across his path. It was an apple, and already a second one came flying after it. In horror, Gregor stopped in his tracks. There was no point continuing to run now that his father decided to bombard him. He had filled his pockets of the fruit bowl in the sideboard, and now is topping apple after apple in Gregor's direction. For a moment, not even bothering to take particular aim, the petite red apples rolled around the floor as if electrified, knocking into each other. One lightly lobbed apple grazed Gregor's back and slid off again harmlessly, but it was immediately followed by another and bent himself in his back. Gregor tried to drag himself forward as if the sudden shocking pain might have vanished in the change of pace, but he felt nailed to the spot and collapsed there. His legs flayed out, all his senses in a state of utter bewilderment. He caught only a last glimpse of the door of his room flying open, his shrieking sister and his mother running out of the room before her, wearing only chemise for his sister, an undressed and unconscious woman, to let her breathe more freely, and he saw his mother rush to his father's side, and her unfastened skirts slipping one by one without her waist as she ran. Saw her stumble across his skirts as she flew herself with his father, embracing him in a perfect union with him. But now Gregor's vision began to fail him. He clasped her with her hands at the back of his father's head and pleaded with him to spare Gregor's life. The grievous wound Gregor had received, which plunged him over a month, the apple remained lodged in his flesh, a visible memento, since no one dared to remove it, seemed to have reminded even his father that Gregor, despite his current laminal repulsive form, was the member of the family who should not be treated like an enemy, for family duty dictated that the others swallow down the disgust he aroused in them and show them tolerance, only tolerance. And even though this wound cost Gregor some of his mobility, probably for good, and for the time being he required many, many minutes to hobble across the room like an old invalid crawling up the walls and out of the question now, he was compensated for his worsening in the condition by what seemed to him a perfectly adequate substitute. As the evening approached, the door to the living room, on which he would start keeping a sharp eye of the hour or two beforehand, would always be opened as it permit him. Lying in his own dark room and invisible from the living room, we watch his entire family sitting at a brightly lit table and listen to the conversations now, as if it were in an officially sanctioned capacity and thus quite differently than before. To be sure, these are no longer animated conversations of earlier times, but Gregor used to think back on a certain longing from various cramped hotel rooms when it was time to throw himself exhausted into the damp bedding. Now everything was fairly quiet. Gregor's father would fall asleep in the armchair soon after supper. His mother and sister would admonish one another in silence. His mother bent far over beneath the light. It would be sewing ladies' under things for the dress shop. His sister, who had taken a job as a salesgirl, was studying stenography and French in the evening so that was possibly moved for a better position later on. Sometimes Gregor's father would wake up and, as if aware he had been sleeping, would say to his Gregor's mother, "How long have you been sewing again today?" and would go right back to sleep. When he would prompt, Gregor's mother and sister exchanged weary smiles. In a particular form of stubbornness, Gregor's father refused to take off the porter's uniform even at home, and while the nightshirt hung uselessly on its hook, he would slumber where he sat, fully clothed as though he remained steady for the service at all times, even where he was waiting for supervisor's call. As a result, his uniform, which had not been new to start with, soon forfeited much of the cleanliness, despite the care lavished by his mother and sister, and Gregor would sometimes gaze for an entire evening at the stain-covered jacket replanted in the gold buttons, always highly polished, in which the old man slept in considerable discomfort but nonetheless soundly. The moment the clock struck 10, Gregor's mother would attempt to rouse his father in a few hushed words and then persuade him to go to bed, for he would get no proper sleep sitting there, and sleep was something Gregor's father, who would report for duty at 6 in the morning, desperately needed. But in keeping the stubbornness that had taken him when he started working as a porter, he always insisted on continuing to sit there at the table, even though he kept falling asleep, and then it was only a greatest effort it would persuade him to exchange armchair for bed. Gregor's mother and sister would persist their little astonishments as doggedly as they liked. For a quarter of an hour he would shake his head slowly, his eyes closed, without getting up. Gregor's mother would pluck at his sleeve, whispering cajoling words in his ear, and his sister would let aside their studies to come to her mother's aid. But to no avail, Gregor's father only settled deeper into his armchair. Only when the woman gripped him beneath the arms would he open his eyes, looking by turns at mother and sister and saying, "What sort of life is this? If this is the peace and quiet of my old age?" Then, supported by two women, he would rise elaborately, as though he himself were receiving a brunt of his burden, and allow the women to escort him to the doorway, where he would shoo them away and continue on his own, while Gregor's mother hastily threw down her sewing and his sister her pen, so they would run after him to offer further assistance. The household was never further reduced. The maid was now let go after all. A bony giant of a chair woman with white hair flapping about her head came by in the morning and evening and performed the heaviest labors. Everyone else was handled by Gregor's mother, along with all her sewing. It even came to pass that several pieces of jewelry had been in the family. Jewels Gregor's mother and sister had delighted in wearing in the entertainments and festivities. They're sold, as Gregor would learn in the evening, and price each piece he has brought would be discussed. But the greatest lament was always that they're unable to leave his apartment, which is far too large for their current circumstances, since no one could imagine how Gregor might have been moved. But Gregor understood that it was not only out of consideration for him that move was being ruled out, since he could only enough have been transported in a crate of appropriate size, with a few air holes. The main thing keeping the family and moving in a new apartment was their complete sense of hopelessness, and thought that they had been struck with misfortune such as no one else in the entire circle of relations had ever experienced. They're fulfilling the utmost in demands in the world makes on the poor. Gregor's father fetched breakfast for the petty employees at the bank. His mother sacrificed herself in the underclothes of the strangers. His sister ran back and forth behind the shop counter for the customer's behest. But it was all going to strength they had, and the wound in Gregor's back would have begun to ache anew when mother and sister, having brought his father to bed, would now return and leaving their work where it lay, huddled close behind another, pressing their cheeks together. When Gregor's mother, gesturing toward the room, would say, "Shut the door now, Great." And when Gregor was left in the dark again, while next door the two women intermingled their tears, or else sat there tearless, staring down at the table. Gregor spent his nights and days almost entirely without sleeping. Sometimes he had thought about taking the family affairs in hand again. He just used to. The next time the door was open, and once more his boss and general manager would appear before his mind's eye after all the time. The clerk in the apprentices, the dull-witted hired man, two or three friends from other firms, and a chambermaid from the Vincent Hotel, a sweet, fleeting spectre, the shop girl from a haberdashery womb he had courted earnestly but too slowly, of all appeared to him, intersped with the strangers of nearly already forgotten. But instead of coming to his aid, that was family, every last one of them was unapproachable, and he was glad when they disappeared. At other times he would not at all in frame of the mind to look after his family. Instead he was filled with rage at how poorly he was attended to, and although he would not imagine anything he could have liked to eat, he plotted how he might have gained access to the pantry so to help himself to what, despite his total absence of hunger, was his due, without bothering to consider how she might give Gregor particular pleasure. His sister would particularly thrust some randomly chosen foodstuff into his room with her foot on her day to work in the morning and the midday, only sweep it out again at night with a quick swipe of the broom, paying no heed if the food had been only barely nibbled at or, as was most often the case now, not touched at all. Setting Gregor's room to rights, a task he now saved for the evening, could not possibly have been done at any other functionality. Great stakes of dirt extended across the walls, with balls of dust and rubbish lying scattered about. At first, when Gregor's sister came into the room, he would position himself in corners, particularly indicative of this problem, to reapproach her, as it were, by the presence there, but he could as well have spent entire weeks sitting there without any improvement on his sister's part. After all, she saw dirt as plainly as he did, but made up her mind to leave it be. At the same time, with the sensitivity that made it in her, one had now taken hold of the family as a whole. She had her guard to make sure his task of tidying Gregor's room was reserved for her. Once Gregor's mother subjected his room through scrubbing, when she accomplished only using up several buckets of water immediately, all this moisture was itself an informant to Gregor, who lay stretched out, bitter and immobile, upon the settee, but his mother did not escape the punishment, for no sooner had his sister remarked the change in Gregor's room in the evening had she ran into the mother's imploringly raised hands, set into weeping so violently that her parents, naturally her father was started out of his chair, at first stood by helpless and astonished, until they began to stir. On the right, Gregor's father reproached his mother for not having left the cleaning to Gregor's room to his sister, while on the left, he shouted at Gregor's sister, threatening that she would never again be permitted to clean Gregor's room while his mother attempted to drag his father, now so agitated he hardly recognized himself, into the bedroom. Gregor's sister, shaking with sobs, pummeled the table with her tiny fist, and Gregor hissed loudly in fury because it had occurred to no one that to shut the door in this room to spare him the sight of this commotion. But even if Gregor's sister, who was exhausted by her professional work, had wearied of caring for Gregor, she positively done, there was only no need for his mother to fill her shoes, and Gregor did have suffered neglect. For now the chairwoman was there, and his old widow, who had seen and survived the worst in her long life in the help of her sturdy bones, felt no particular repugnance toward Gregor. Without being all inquisitive, he had once chanced to open the door of his room, and, seeing Gregor, who had begun to run back and forth although no one was chasing him, she stood there staring in astonishment, her hands clasped across her lap. Ever since, they never failed to open the door in the crack of the moment every morning, meaning to look at him. At the beginning, she would call him over, saying that they would probably intend to found friendly, like, "Hey, over here, you old dung beetle," or "Just look at that old dung beetle," thus addressed. Gregor gave no reply, but insisted to remain where he was, immobile, as if the door had never been opened. If only the chairwoman, instead of being allowed to disturb him uselessly at whim, and even giving instruction to clean his room daily. Once early in the morning, a heavy rain, perhaps already important coming spring, was beating against the window pane. Gregor was so infuriated the chairwoman started up again with her quips that he turned on her as if to attack, immediately, slowly, decrepitly. But instead of being frightened, the chairwoman just picked up the chair that was standing beside the door and held it high in the air. And she stood there, her mouth gaped wide. Her intention was clear, not to close her mouth again until the chair in her hand had been crouching down upon Gregor's back. "Aha, so that's as far as it goes," she asked Gregor to turn around, and she placed the chair calmly back in his corner. Gregor now ate almost nothing at all, only if it happened by chance to wander past the food that had been prepared for him that might be fully to take a bite of something into his mouth, where he would hold it for hours, and then usually spit it out again later. At first he thought it was sorrow of the state of his room and prevented from eating, but the fact he had reassigned himself very quickly to the changes here. Everyone had gotten into the habit of using his room to store things where there's no place in the other part of the apartment. But now there was so much things, since one room of the apartment had been rented out to 3 lodgers. The solemn gentlemen, all 3 of them were bearded, as Gregor once noted, peering through the crack of the door, were scrupulously intent on having everything tidy, not just in their room, but also, since they're now paying rent here, in the entire household, particularly the kitchen. They could not bear the presence of an unnecessary, much less dirty items. Moreover, they had brought most of their own furnishings with them. For this reason, many things had become superfluous, things that could not be sold, but they're too valuable to throw out. All this found ways into Gregor's room, as did the ash box and the garbage garbage pail in the kitchen. The chairwoman, always in a great hurry, would simply fling any unserviceable item into Gregor's room. Mercifully, Gregor generally saw only the object in question in the hand that held it. The chairwoman may have intended at some point, when she had occasion of 3 minutes, to come collect these things, or else throw them all out at once. But as they remained wherever they first landed, except when Gregor made his way through the refuse, stirring it around. At first, out of necessity, since there was no room left for it to crawl about, but later with ever-increasing pleasure, though after these wanderings, which left him morally exhausted and sad. He would spend hours without moving, since these lodgers sometimes also took their supper at home and shared a living room. The living room door remained shut for some evenings, but Gregor has opted to forego having the door open. In fact, even when it was open, he sometimes failed to take advantage of it. Instead, unbeknownst to his family, would remain lying in the darkest corner of the room. Once, however, the chairwoman had left the door into the living room slightly ajar, and ajar remained even when the lodgers came in that evening and struck their light. They sat down at the head of the table where the earlier times Gregor had sat with his father and mother, unfolded the napkins, and took up their knives and forks. At once Gregor's mother appeared in the doorway with a serving dish filled with meat, and right behind her came his sister, bearing a plate piled high with potatoes. A heavy vapor rose in the steaming food. The lodgers bent over the dishes that had been placed before him, as though wishing to inspect them before beginning their meal. And in fact, the one who sat in the middle and appeared to be the authority figure of the other two cut off a piece of meat right there on the platter to check whether it was tender enough and didn't have to be sent back to the kitchen. He was satisfied, and Gregor's mother and sister, who had been watching nervously, now smiled with relief. The family members themselves ate in the kitchen. Nonetheless, Gregor's father visited the living room on his way to the kitchen. With a single bow, cap in hand, took a tour around the table. The lodgers all rose from their seats and mumbled to their billiards. Left alone again, they almost ate in perfect silence. It struck Gregor as a peculiar. They amid all the various sounds of this meal, one could also make out their championing teeth, as if to demonstrate to Gregor that person needs teeth to eat, and that almost splendid jaws, if toothless, can accomplish nothing at all. I'm hungry, Gregor thought sorrowfully to himself, but not for these things. Just look how these lodgers take their nourishment, while I am wasting away. On this very evening, Gregor couldn't remember having heard the violin once in all his time. The sound of it was heard coming from the kitchen. The lodgers had already finished their evening meal. The one in the middle had pulled the newspaper, giving each of the others a page, and now the three of them were reading and leaning back in their chairs and smoking. When the violin began to play, their interest was piqued. They got up from their chairs and tiptoed over to the door leading to the vestibule, where they stood in a tight cluster. The sound of the activity must have traveled to the kitchen, for Gregor's father now playing out. Are you gentlemen disturbed by this playing? It can be silenced at once. On the contrary, said the one in the middle, would the young lady care to join us and play here in the living room? There's much more comfortable and pleasant. Why, of course, Gregor's father exclaimed, as though if there were a violinist. The gentleman went back into the room and waited. Soon Gregor's father arrived with the music stand. Would the young lady care to join us and play here in the living room, where it is much more comfortable and pleasant? Why, of course, Gregor's father exclaimed, as though they were violinists. The gentleman went back into the room and waited. Soon Gregor's father arrived with the music stand. His mother had the sheet music, and his sister played the violin. His sister calmly prepared to play. His parents, who had never rented out the rooms in earlier days and therefore treated these lodgers with exaggerated deference, did not even dare to sit in their own armchairs. His father leaned against the door, his right hand tucked between his two buttons of the closed livery jacket. His mother, meanwhile, was offered an armchair by one of the lodgers, and since he left the chair where he had happened to place it, he sat off to the side in the corner. Gregor's sister began to play. On the other side, his father and mother attentively followed each movement of their hands, attracted by her playing. Gregor had ventured that bit further than usual, was already sticking his head through the living room. It scarcely surprised him that he had become so inconsiderate of the others earlier on. His considerators had been forced to pride, and had all more reason to keep himself hidden away now. Thanks to the dust that lay everywhere in his room, would whirl up the slightest motion. He too was covered in dust. He dragged around threads and hair of food scraps clinging to the back of his sides. His general indifference was far too great now for him to keep up with the habit he once practiced several times a day, flipping over the scrub his back against the rug. Despite his condition, he did not hesitate now to continue his advance a little way onto the immaculate floor of the living room. To be sure, no one paid him the slightest heed. The family was completely absorbed in the violin playing. The lodgers, on the other hand, having the first positioned themselves, hands in their trouser pockets, much too close behind the sister's music stand, so they could all look at the sheet music, which surely must have distracted her, soon withdrew the window, conversing in the undertone, and remained there, anxiously observed by Gregor's father. It appeared more than clear that they had been disappointed in their expectation of hearing beautiful or entertaining violin music, and now, tired of the whole performance, were continuing to tolerate the disturbance of their peace only out of politeness, particularly in the way in which all of them were blowing the smoke of their cigars higher into the air for their noses and mouths suggests extreme agitation. And yet his sister's playing was so lovely, her face was so tilted to one side, searchingly sadly, her eyes followed the line of notes. Gregor kept a bit farther forward and ducked his head down to the close of the floor, so he perhaps to catch her eye. He was a beast. That music who moved him. He felt as he were being shown the way of the unknown nourishment he craved. He was determined to creep all the way up to his sister, to pluck the skirt in his way to indicate to her that she would come to his room and play her violin. So no one here was rewarding her playing and meant to reward her. How could he not allow her to leave his room ever again? At least the song he was alive. The terrific figure would, for the first time ever, be useful to him. He could see all the doors and rooms at once, growling at its attackers, but sister would remain with him, not by force, but by their own free will. She would sit beside him in the study, bend down and better to hear, and would confess to her that his dad had the firm intention of sending him to the conservatory, and that if the disaster had not disrupted his plans, he would have made general announcement last Christmas. Christmas has passed now, hadn't it? Without letting himself be swayed by the objections of any sorts, after declaration his sister had been moved to the point of tears, and Gregor would raise himself to the height of an armpit and kiss her throat, which, now he had been to the office every day. He wore a free ribbon of collar. Herr Samsa, the gentleman in the middle, shouted at Gregor's father, and without saying a single word, pointed his finger at Gregor, who was now only advancing. The violin fell silent. The middle lodger at first just smiled and shook his head, turning forward his head, and then looked again at Gregor. Gregor's father apparently found the task of dragging Gregor back into his room less urgent than that of calming the lodgers, despite of the fact that they did not appear particularly worked up and seemed to be finding Gregor the most entertaining in the music. He hurried over to them and tried with outspread arms to herd them back into the room, at the same time using his body to shield Gregor from the new view. And so they did, in fact, become a little angry, though it was no longer clear whether it was account of Gregor's father's behavior or the realization dawning on them that without their knowledge they might have been sharing the room with a roommate of his sort. They demanded explanations of Gregor's father. Now it was their turn to throw their arms into the chair. They plucked uneasily at their beards and only slowly withdrew the direction of the room. Meanwhile, Gregor's sister, who had been standing there at a loss since her playing had been so unexpectedly interrupted, she still held violin and a bow in her carelessly dangling hands, looking over the notes as though she was continuing to play. All at once pulled herself together, laid her instrument on the lap of her mother, who was sat in the armchair, her lungs heaving as she thought to breathe, and ran into the next room, toward which the lodgers were now moving somewhat more quickly as Gregor's father urged them now on. One saw how, beneath the sister's practiced hands, the beds, blankets, and pillows flew into the air into orderliness. Even before the lodgers reached the room, she had finished making up the beds and slipped out. Gregor's father appeared to be once more so firmly in the grip of his own stubbornness, he felt the basic respect that, after all, he owed his tenants. He kept on pressing and urging until, already standing in the doorway, the middle lodger thunderously stamped his foot, causing Gregor's father to stop short. "I hereby declare," he said, raising his hand and seeking out Gregor's mother and sister, who glanced at, "that in consideration of reprehensible circumstances prevailing in this apartment and family," and there he spat on the floor without forethought, "I give notice on my room effective immediately. It goes without saying that I will not pay a penny for the days I have spent here. On the contrary, I shall consider whether or not to pursue with, please believe me, easily justifiable claims." He fell silent and went looking straight for her expectantly, and indeed his two friends once chimed with the words, "We too give notice effective immediately." Here up and he seized the door handle and with a great clash slammed the door. Gregor's father staggered his armchair with a groping hands and let himself fall into it. It looked as though he was stretching on his customary evening nap, but the violent nodding of his anchorless head showed that he was absolutely not sleeping. Gregor had gone to lying quietly on the spot where the lodgers had espied him. His disappointment that the failure of his plan and perhaps also the weakness caused by starvation had rendered him incapable of moving. With a certain defiantness he sensed terrified that everything was about to collapse all around him, and so he waited. Not even the violin started him when it fell to his mother's lap beneath the trembling fingers, giving off the note that echoed in the air. "Dear parents," his sister said, striking the table by the way of preamble, "things cannot go on like this. Even if you two perhaps do not realize it, I most certainly do. I am unwilling to utter my father's name before this creature, and therefore will only say we have to try to get rid of it. We have done everything humanly possible to care for it and show it tolerance. I don't think anyone should reapproach just on this account." "He is right 1,000 times over," Gregor's father murmured under his breath. His mother, still incapable of breathing freely, began to cough dully into her lifted hand, the lunatic expression in her eyes. Gregor's sister hurried over to their mother and held her forehead. Her words seemed to have given her father an idea, for how she sat up straight, playing with her uniform cap between the plates left behind on the table of the lodger's supper, and glancing over his time to quiet at Quiet, Gregor. We have to try to get rid of it, his sister said, addressing her words exclusively for Gregor's father this time, for his mother was coughing too hard to hear anything. It'll be the death of you two. I can see it now. When people have to work as hard as all of us have been doing, it is impossible to endure these endless torments at home. I cannot bear it anymore either. And she burst into sobs, weeping so forcibly that her tears flowed down to his mother's face, from which the girl wiped with a mechanical gesture. Child, his father said sympathetically, and with a noticeable compassion, but what can he do? Gregor's sister just shrugged in the shoulders of the sign of helplessness, but had come over her while she was weeping, in contrast to the confidence and display of the moment before. If he understood us, Gregor's father said, half questioning his sister, still caught up by their weeping, shook one hand vehemently at the sign of how unthinkable she found this. If he understood us, his father repeated, closing his eyes to absorb their conviction, as utterly out of the question. Then it might be possible to come to an agreement with him, but as the other things stand, it has to go, your sister cried out. What's the only way, father? You have to try to let go of the notion that this thing is Gregor. The real disaster that we believed this for so long. But now it could be Gregor. If it were Gregor, it would realize that a long time ago that it wasn't possible for human beings to live alongside such a creature. It would have gone away on its own. We still would have to be lacking a brother, but we would have been able to go on living and honoring his memory. But now we have a beast tormenting us. It drives away our lodgers and apparently intends to take over the entire apartment if it helps us together. Just look, father, he suddenly shrieked. It's starting again, and it's just frightening and Gregor found bewildering. She now went as far as to leave her mother behind, launching herself from her chair, as if she would rather sacrifice her mother than remain in Gregor's proximity, and ran to take cover behind her father, who, agitated by the way she was carrying on, rose from his own chair and half raised his arm as if to shield her. But Gregor was far from wanting to frighten anyone, above all his sister. All he'd done was turn around and make his way back into his room. Admittedly, his operation would have been hard not to notice, since his current injured state he was obliged to use the head to help with his difficult maneuver. He kept raising it up and then thumping against the floor, pausing as he glanced around. His good intentions seemed to only be recognized. It had been only momentary fright. Now all of them gazed sadly in silence. His mother lay in the armchair, her extended legs pressed together, barely able to keep her eyes open in her exhaustion. His father and sister sat side by side, and his sister had draped one hand across his father's neck. Perhaps I was allowed to turn around now, Gregor thought, and resumed his labors. He'd not entirely suppressed the wheezing and exertion produced, and now, when he had rest, otherwise no one was harassing him, he had been left to attend his matters on his own. When he had completed his rotation, he immediately made a straight for the door in his room. He was astonished at how great a distance separated him from his destination. He didn't understand how weak he was. He had been able to traverse the same distance in a little while before, almost without noticing, steadfastly concentrating only on crawling as quickly as possible. He scarcely paid any heed to the fact that a word, not a cry, came from his family to disturb him. But then only in the doorway did he turn his head, not all the way around, as he felt his neck growing stiff. But when even so he was able to see it that was changed behind him, except that the sister had risen to her feet. Last thing he saw was a glimpse of his mother, who had now fallen entirely asleep. No sooner was he in his room again than the doors hastily pressed shut, locked and bolted, and sudden commotion of his back gave him a frightful start, for his low legs gave way beneath him. It was his sister who hurried thus. He was already trying to stand there upright and waiting. Then past the light-footedly Gregor did hear her approach, and cried out finally to her parents as she turned the key on the lock. And now, Gregor wondered, looking around in the dark, he soon made discover that he was no longer capable of moving at all. He wasn't surprised at this. On the contrary, it struck him as unnatural that he had acted until now able to support himself on those tiny thin legs. As for the rest, he felt relatively ease. Immediately his entire body was racked in pain, but it seemed to him that it was gradually becoming weaker and weaker, and in the end it would fade away altogether. Already he could scarcely feel the rotting apple on his back, though the inflamed area around it, both now involved in the soft dust. He thought back on his family with tenderness and love. In his opinion, he must have said means to disappear, and possibly even more empathetic than his of his sister. He remained in his state of empty, peaceful reflection until the clock tower struck the 3rd hour of morning. He watched as everything began to light around his window. Then his head sank all the way to the floor without violation from his nostrils. His last breath faintly streamed. When the Stryer woman arrived early the next morning, slamming the door so loudly that in her strength and haste, often she had been asked to avoid this, that sleep was out of the question anywhere in the apartment after her arrival. Her usual courtesy A visit to Gregor's room revealed at first nothing out of the ordinary. She thought he was lying there motionless on purpose, feigning an indigestion. He considered him perfectly capable of rational thought. Since she happened to be holding a long broom in her hand, she tried to tickle Gregor with it in the doorway. When even this had no effect, she grew vexed and began to poke Gregor a little, and only when she had actually shifted him from the spot where he lay with no resistance and all were suspicions roused. When no soon after the facts of the matter came clear to her, he gawked in surprise, gave a low whistle, and then without further delay flung open the door to the bedroom with a loud voice shouted in the darkness. "Come have a look, it's gone," it croaked. "It's laying there, dead as doornail." Sam's couple shot upright in their martial bed and first had a struggle to recover from the shock of the chairwoman's conduct before they were able to grasp their words. But then Herr and Frau Salzmann hurriedly got to the bed on the other side. Herr Salzmann threw the blanket about his shoulders while Frau Salzmann emerged wearing only her nightdress. In this state, they entered Gregor's room. Meanwhile, the doors of the living room, where Getty had been sleeping since the lodger's arrival, had opened as well. She was fully dressed, as though she had not slept at all, as even the pallor of her cheeks seemed to prove. "Dead?" Frau Salzmann asked, looking questioningly up at the chairwoman. Although she herself was free to investigate, and indeed could see how things stood even when without hesitation. "I would say so," the chairwoman said, and by way of proof pushed Gregor's corpse quite some way to the side of her broom. Frau Salzmann made a gesture as though he wanted to hold back his broom, but didn't. "Well," Herr Salzmann said, "now we thank God." He crossed himself, and the three women followed his example. Gretty, who would not take her eyes off the corpse for a moment, said, "Just look how skinny he was. He went such a long time without eating anything at all. All the food that went to his room would come out again just as before." And indeed, Gregor's body was completely flat and dry, which hadn't really been noticeable until now, when he was no longer raised on those low legs, and nothing else remained of the distant gaze. "Gret, come sit by us for a bit," Frau Salzmann with a melancholy smile, and Gret, glancing back at the corpse, following her parents into the bedroom. The chairwoman shut the door and opened the window wide. Despite the early morning, the crisp air was always tempered by the certain mildness. After all, it was already the end of March. The three lodgers now emerged from their room and looked at the astonishment for the breakfast. They had been forgotten. "Where's breakfast?" the one in the middle asked the chairwoman peevishly, but she just put a finger on her lips and then quietly, without a word, beckoned the lodgers into Gregor's room. She bade them into their hands in the pockets of their slightly threadbare low jackets. They surrounded Gregor's corpse in the room that had been meanwhile so quite bright. And the bedroom door opened and Herr Salzmann appeared wearing his livery, with his wife on one arm and his daughter on the other. All three looked as if they had been weeping. Gret kept passing her face against her father's arm. "Leave my home at once," Herr Salzmann said, pointing at the door without letting go of the womenfolk. "What do you mean?" the gentleman in the middle inquired, dumbfounded, and gave a saccharine smile. The other two held their hands at their backs and kept rubbing them together uninterruptedly, as if in gleeful expectation of a fight that was certain to decide in their favor. "I mean exactly what I say," Herr Salzmann replied, now advancing the lodger flanked by his two companions. The lodger just stood there at first, looked at the ground as if all the things were rearranging themselves in his head into a new order. "So we'll be leaving," he said then, looking up at Herr Salzmann as if his new humility had suddenly come over him and required him to petition to approval even his decision. Herr Salzmann merely nodded curtly in his direction a few times, goggle-eyed at this, and gentleman did, in fact, made haste to stride back out of the vestibule, where his two friends had listening attentively for some moments, their hands at rest, and now they practically hopped and skipped in their hurry to follow. As if word, Herr Salzmann might somehow proceed into the vestibule, cutting off their line of communication with their leader. In the vestibule, all three of them took their hats on the coat rack, withdrew their walking sticks from the cane stand, made a silent bow, and left the apartment, displaying what soon proved to be utterly dumbfounded mistrustfulness. Herr Salzmann stepped out into the landing of the two women, leaning against the banister. They watched the three gentlemen descending the long staircase, moving slowly but at a steady pace, and disappearing into the floor of the certain bend of the stairway, only to appear again a few moments later. The farther down they went, the more the Salzmann family's interest in them faded, and when the butcher's apprentice came forward and then passed them on the way out, profoundly bearing his tray upon his head. Herr Salzmann, the woman abandoned the banister, and all of them returned, seemingly relieved, to their apartment. They decided to spend the day resting to go out for a stroll. They had not only earned the respite of their work, but desperately needed of it, and so they outside of the table wrote 3 letters of excuse. Herr Salzmann to the supervisor, Frau Salzmann to her employer, and Gretty to his supervisor. While they were writing, the chairwoman came in as she was leaving. Her morning's work was completed. The 3 scribes at first merely nodded without looking up, and only when the chairwoman failed to do on her way did they glance up in annoyance. "Well?" Herr Salzmann asked. The chairwoman stood smiling in the doorway as if she had splendid good fortune to announce to the family, but wouldn't do so until she was properly questioned. The nearly typical little ostrich feathers on her hat, which had annoyed Herr Salesman for as long as she had been in the family service. Bob gently in all directions. "So what is it you want?" she asked, Bob by Frau Salesman, the member of the family for whom the chairwoman still had most respect. "Well," the chairwoman replied, for her own good-natured laughter making it impossible at first for her to go on to speaking, "there's no need for you to go worry about how to get rid of that mess in there. It's already taken care of." Frau Salesman bent down over their letters as they went to go writing. Herr Salesman, who saw the chairwoman was about to start describing everything in detail, summarily silenced her with an outstretched hand. And since she was not permitted to say what she had wished, she suddenly remembered the great hurry she was in. And so with the insulted air she cried, "So long, everyone," turned wildly on her heel, and with the most excruciating slamming of doors left the apartment. "Tonight she'll be let go," Herr Salesman said, received an answer neither from his wife nor his daughter, for the chairwoman seemed to have disturbed the equanimity that they had already just attained. They arose from their seat, went to the window, and remained here for their arms about each other. Herr Salesman turned to his chair and looked at him and observed him quietly for a little while, then cried out, "So come here already. Let those old matters rest, and show a little consideration for me as well." At once the woman obeyed, hurried over to him, and caressed him, and quickly finished their letters. When all three of them left the apartment together, something was not done in months, and took the electric tram all the way to the open countryside at the edge of town. The car in which they sat all alone and entirely suffused with warm sunlight. Closely leaning back in their seats, they discussed their future prospects, and on closer investigation it appeared these prospects were not bad at all. For all three of their positions, something they had never before properly discussed were quite in fact advantageous, and above all, offered promising opportunities in advancement. The greatest and immediate improvement for the situation, of course, would be quickly achieved by moving to the new apartment. They now wished for to take a smaller and cheaper, but more convenient and above all more practical flat in their current one, which had been picked out for them by Gregor. As they were conversing in this way, Herr and Frau Salesman were stuck almost as one while observing their daughter, who was growing ever more vivacious. But the thought, and despite all the torments had been made her cheeks grow pale. She has recently blossomed to a beautiful girl, growing quieter now and communicating with one another almost unanimously by exchange of glances. They thought about how it would soon find her a good husband, and when they arrived at their destination, it seemed to them almost confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions, when her daughter swiftly sprang to her feet and stretched her young body. Afterward, The Death of the Salesman by Susan Bernofsky. Kafka's celebrated novella, The Metamorphosis, died Verdung, was written a century ago, in the late 1912, during which a period in which he was having difficulty making progress on his first novel, on November 17th, 1912. Kafka wrote to his fiancée Felice Baer, he was working on the story that came to me in the misery of lying in bed, and it was haunting him. He hoped to get it written down quickly. He hadn't yet realized how long it would be, as he felt it would turn out the best if he would write it in just one or two long sittings. But there were many interruptions, and it complicated the Felice several times, that the delays were damaging the story. 3 weeks later it was finished, on December 7th, though it would be another 3 years before the story saw print. As we know from Mad Brock's diary, Kafka read his bug piece, Wazenschach, aloud his friends on November 24th, 1912, the first section, and again on December 15th, people started talking about it, and Kafka received a query in the publisher Kurt Wolff on March 13, 1913, on the recommendation of Kafka's friend Franz Werfel. Franz Blee, the literary editor of the new avant-garde journal Die Wievenblätter, expressed interest, and Robert Musil wrote as well, soliciting the novella for a more established Die Neue Lesendbuch, which it was technically too long for his magazine format. But months passed before Kafka a clean manuscript ready for submission, and when World War I intervened, causing further delays, Musil was called up to serve, and because of the war, Blade decided to stop printing literary texts. In the spring of 1915, Rentschlichdale took over the editor-in-chief of Die Wiesenblätter, in which Max Brods helped Kafka and the story here, and came out on October 15th, 1915. And then it appeared in December 1915, though dated 1916, a slender volume published at Kurt Wolff Verlag in Leipzig. The story's protagonist, Gregor Salesman, and the quintessential Kafka anti-hero, he has worked himself to the point of utter exhaustion to pay off his parents' debts, and a grotesque metamorphosis and a physical manifestation of his abstinence. And exactly as he transformed into. In Kafka's correspondence with the publisher, he admitted that it was an insect, not to be depicted in the jacket of the book, and although he was friends to the word bug, wanzi, and referring casually to the word, The language that appears in the novella itself carefully chosen to avoid specificity. The infinite unhigers, unhueris, unzephyr, and the opening sentence poses one of the greatest challenges in the translator. It's above adjective ungulated, meaning monstrous or huge, and the noun ungzephyr, or negations virtual non-entities, prefixed by the ungezephyr, comes from the Middle High German ungezebär, a negation of the Old High German zebar, related to the Old English teber, meaning sacrifice or sacrificial animal, and ungezebär, then an unclean animal unfit for sacrifice. And ungeziefer describes a class of nasty, creepy, crawly things. The word in German suggests primarily six-legged creatures, though it was otherwise resembles the English word vermin, which refers primarily to rodents. Ungeziefer is also used formally the equivalent of bug, though incarnation is dirty, nasty bug. You wouldn't apply the word cute, helpful creatures like ladybugs in my translation. Gregor has transformed into some sort of monstrous insect, and some sort of attitude blurred the border of somewhat too specific insect. I think Kafka wanted us to see Gregor's new body in the condition of the same hazy focus in which Gregor himself discovers him. A new blurred focus applies in other aspects of the story. Although Vladimir Nazarov and his pension exit had mapped out the salesman flat in some detail, I am far from certain that Kafka himself, which is the pension and blurred perception of bewilderment, has much concern in the apartment's precise geography, and as many rooms as the apartment have. Many, too many. Just as Gregor, lying on his back in the story opening sentences, discovers that these many little legs waving in the air above him were both physical correlatives of life has gotten out of hand, Kafka is not even particularly attentive to the continuity of this cast of characters. Early on in the story, we see a maid give notice and flee, only to find her still working in the household several pages later, in fact, doing all the cooking, since now is the cook who quit. Except for the chairwoman, who still plays a starring role in the penultimate scenes. The household help is just part of the furniture of the story, like the cabinet that gets shifted to another room. Even the main characters tend to appear categorically named after their functions: father, mother, sister. Only one of them gets a name, Gretty, rhymes with beta. But even she is usually referred to as sister, or out, until the decisive moment near the end when she becomes, instead of daughter, by defining all these characters through her relationship to Gregor. Kafka shyly allows Gregor's point of view to dominate the story even when he's not actually present in the scene being described. One Ladymouth was unable to preserve in the translation the theme of ruhig. Ruhig denotes calm, peaceful, quiet, tranquil, at ease, and unruhig is opposite, starting from the unrich Traumen, troubled dreams. In the first sentence, the narrative oscillates between troubled and troubled, tranquil and harried, peaceful and unsettled. Since no one word in English fits well enough to context Kafka presence, I decided to translate the word in many different ways. But note when you are reading all these synonyms that you are watching a motif unfold. The post-metamorphosis activity that gives Gregor the greatest sense of freedom appears in the translation as crawling. He enjoys crawling around the walls and ceiling of his room. Ironically, the German verb klitschen, which also translates as to creep, has the additional meaning to cower. To klitschen before someone is to act fancifully toward him. In a sense, too, Gregor's new physical state appears the representation of his long-standing spiritual agedness. Finally, Gregor has only himself to blame for the wretchedness of the situation, since he was willingly accepted the wretchedness as it was thrust upon him. Like other of the Kafka's doomed protagonists, the heirs by failing to act instead of falling himself to acted upon. Gregor Salesman's giant bug is a cartoonist subaltern of human being turned inside out. He was traded in the spine for exoskeleton, but even an armor like shell, carapace, and armor are the same word in German, Panzer. In no defense, once a suddenly powerful father starts pelting them with apples, an ironically biblical choice of weapon. Gregor is a salesman, but as he told himself, his own agency and dignity making him sell out through and through. For this reason, I occasionally use the word drummer, a commercial traveler, to describe his profession, referring back to another of his ilk, a hard-working drummer who landed the ash and might rest them. At Willie Loman as described by Arthur Miller in Death of the Salesman, 1949, the Metamorphosis is Kafka's own Death of the Salesman, which are all sad, grubby tragedy and all squalor like Willie Loman. Gregor is a suicide. Though of a different sort, he dies of hunger artist, perishes in starvation with nothing tastes good to him anymore, and like Willie's, Gregor's death of this final surface he performs to the benefit of his family. At the same time, Kafka's tragic tale, unlike Miller's, is often hilariously funny. I imagine Kafka laughing uproariously when reading his story to his friends. Gregor Nevati, one might call him gullibility, combined his earnest and the tendency to sound somewhat overwrought and assertions are perfectly reasonable. To bring out his side of the story, I emphasize the slight tone of hysteria in Gregor's voice, whether it seemed justified. The story was brutally comic in parts, but never more than at the moment, and revealed that, despite that, in fact, that Gregor might be living more than less an injured servant to pay off his servant's ancient debts. In fact, his family has plenty of money, not enough to allow him to stop working altogether, but a proper low nest egg. And although they are described as poor, they are never too hard to retain the services of at least one domestic servant. One last translation problem in the story is the title itself. Unlike the English Metamorphosis, the German word Verwandlung does not suggest a natural change of state associated with the animal kingdom, such as the change of a caterpillar to butterfly. Instead, this word from fairy tales is used to describe the transformation, say, of a girl's 7 brothers into swans. But the word metamorphosis refers to this too. Its first definition in the Oxford English Dictionary is the action or process of changing in form, shape, or substance, especially transformation by supernatural beings. This is the sense in which it's used. For instance, a translation of Ovid as a title for its rich, complex story, it strikes me as the most luminous, suggestive choice. Finally, I would like to thank the friends and colleagues who helped me with suggestions and kind of editorial interventions while working on the translation: Barbara Ifler, Edith Grossman, Elliot Weinberger, Baron Mitchell, Chris Hockey, Richard Gurr, Emily Broman, Amanda Hong, and especially Sean Cotter, Glenn Hertz, and Tim Watson. I would also like to thank Carol Bemis, Thea Goodrich, and Alan Bellman and Era Schwalla. New York, August 2013.